The local universe of Nebadon represents a vast and intricate administrative undertaking designed to facilitate the evolutionary ascent of mortal beings from the material worlds toward the spiritual perfection of paradise. Within this complex hierarchy, there exists an order of being that is uniquely situated at the intersection of the material and the spiritual, serving as the permanent citizens of the inhabited worlds. These beings, known as midway creatures, occupy a life-functioning level approximately halfway between the mortals of the realm and the various angelic orders, such as the seraphim. While they are often described as an accident of time due to the unusual circumstances attending their genesis on various planets, they occur so widely and provide such indispensable service that they are universally recognized as an essential component of the planetary ministry in the Satania system. On Urantia, the designation of midwayers refers to two distinct groups: the primary or senior corps, which emerged during the era of the planetary prince, and the secondary or younger group, which appeared in the aftermath of the Adamic mission. These beings do not sleep, do not procreate in their current state, and do not experience the biological decay associated with mortal life. Instead, they function as a continuous link of consciousness and memory for the planet, maintaining the traditions of Urantia across the vast epochs of human history. Their determination is best encapsulated by the motto of their order: "What the united midwayers undertake, the united midwayers do." The origin of the primary midwayers is fundamentally rooted in the unique interassociation of the material and the spiritual that characterized the regime of the planetary prince, Caligastia, approximately 500,000 years ago. This group emerged as a direct result of the presence of the 100 corporeal members of the prince's staff, who were assigned to Urantia to foster the early development of human civilization. These staff members were originally morontia citizens of Jerusalem, the capital of the Satania system, and were of an ascendant nature, possessing no innate reproductive prerogatives. However, to effectively minister to the primitive human races, they were reconstituted as material sex creatures, equipped with the capacity to procreate offspring through a combination of their special order and the selected stock of the Adamsonite tribes. The technical mechanism of the primary midwayer's appearance involved a supermaterial and non-sexual liaison between male and female members of the corporeal staff. While the records indicate that these individuals were capable of physical reproduction, the first group of midwayers resulted from a specialized energetic association that the celestial authorities describe as difficult to satisfactorily explain to human intellect. This supermaterial parental role was initially granted to only 50 couples of the staff, resulting in the birth of the first 50 midwayers. Following a year of observation, the planetary prince authorized the reproduction of these beings without restriction, recognizing their immense utility in the administration of the planetary headquarters at Dalmatia. The production process was highly regulated, with a period of 1/2 year intervening between the birth of each midwayer. This creative power was mysteriously exhausted upon the appearance of the 1,000th offspring for each couple. These 50,000 primary midwayers functioned as the intelligence core of the prince's administration, ranging far and wide across the world to observe human races and influence social development. They were invaluable in the work of the prince and his staff, serving as the eyes and ears of the planetary government in regions far removed from headquarters. The trajectory of the midway creatures was permanently altered by the outbreak of the Lucifer rebellion, approximately 200,000 years ago. This insurrection, initiated by the system's sovereign Lucifer and supported by his lieutenant Satan, sought to establish planetary independence and denied the authority of the Paradise Trinity. On Urantia, the planetary prince Caligastia and his chief of staff Abaddon joined the rebellion, leading to a catastrophic split within the planetary administration. The rebellion had a devastating impact on the primary midwayers, who were intimately connected to the prince's regime. A significant majority of the corps, over 4/5, followed Caligastia into secession. These rebel midwayers allied themselves with Beelzebub, the leader of the disloyal group, and spent millennia influencing human society toward disharmony and confusion. The loyal corps, however, entered the service of the Melchizedek receivers, functioning under the leadership of Van and the primary midwayer known as 123, the First. The rebel midwayers remained active on Urantia for hundreds of thousands of years, often influencing the minds of susceptible mortals. It was only after the bestowal of Michael, Jesus, that their influence was effectively curtailed. Currently, the entire group of rebel midwayers is held prisoner by order of the Most Highs of Urantia, awaiting final adjudication. The loyal midwayers, in contrast, were recognized for their steadfastness and were eventually amalgamated into the United Midwayers of Urantia. To understand the origin of the secondary midwayers, one must first examine the history of the Nodites, who provided half of the ancestry for this younger order. The Nodites were the descendants of the 60 rebel members of the planetary prince's corporeal staff, who, following the rebellion and the loss of their supermaterial status, engaged in sexual reproduction with the evolutionary tribes of Urantia. Because the original staff members had been sustained by the life maintenance circuits of the Satania system, their offspring possessed physical, intellectual, and spiritual capacities that were far superior to the surrounding Adamite and Sangic peoples. The Nodites eventually founded several centers of civilization, the most prominent being the city of Dilmun. Their cultural history is marked by a persistent sense of racial superiority and a desire to regain the status they felt had been lost during the rebellion. This ambition culminated in the project known as the Tower of Babel, led by a descendant named Bablot. The project failed due to internal conflict and a lack of unified support, but the Nodite genetic strain remained a potent influence on the planet. It was the union of this modified Adamite/Nodite germplasm with the later appearing Adamic race that led to the emergence of the secondary order of midway creatures. The secondary midwayers represent a younger order whose origin dates from the times of Adam and Eve, approximately 37,000 years ago. Their ancestry is distinct from the primary corpse, involving a unique synthesis of the violet race and the Nodite strain. The narrative of their origin centers on Adamson, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve on Urantia, and his eventual union with Rada, a descendant of the rebel staff members. This union of the high-energy Adamic line with the long-lived Nodite heritage resulted in the appearance of a new order of being. Unlike the primary midwayers, who were produced through a supermaterial liaison sanctioned by the prince, the secondary midwayers appeared as a spontaneous but valuable accident in the post-Adamic era. They are described as being nearer man than angel, and are highly sympathetic in their contact with human beings because they are, in a genetic sense, of the human races of the planet. The original secondary corpse numbered 1,984 individuals. In terms of personality and gender, they are differentiated along the lines of maleness and femaleness, often being referred to as he or she, and frequently working in pairs. To distinguish them from the numerical designations of the primary order, the secondary midwayers are designated alphabetically in the planetary records. The midway creatures exist on a life-functioning level that is neither material in the human sense nor purely spiritual in the angelic sense. They are non-material regarding nutrition and energy intake, meaning they do not require the ingestion of food or water to maintain their existence. Instead, they are sustained by the direct absorption of universe energy circuits, a mechanism that renders them immune to the physical limitations of mortal biology. Despite their non-biological nature, midwayers partake of many human traits. They are capable of enjoying human humor and participating in religious worship. They do not experience the biological necessity for sleep, allowing them to maintain a continuous, 24-hour administration of planetary affairs. This lack of rhythmic downtime makes them highly efficient observers and sentinels for the celestial government. midwayers exist just outside the range of normal mortal vision. However, the secondary midwayers possess a sufficient latitude of adaptation to make, at will, physical contact with material things. This ability allows them to manipulate physical objects, control animals, and interact with the material world in ways that often appear miraculous to humans. The primary midwayers find it much more difficult to make direct contact with material agencies, and usually require the assistance of the secondary order or other intermediaries to influence the physical realm. Unlike the various orders of celestial beings who are assigned to a planet for temporary periods of service, midwayers are the permanent citizens of Urantia. They remain on the sphere from the early days of the planetary prince until the far distant time when the world is settled in light and life. This continuity makes them the actual custodians of the planet, as they possess a treasure house of traditions and memories that mortal generations inevitably forget. Following the bestowal of the Spirit of Truth at Pentecost, the loyal members of both the primary and secondary orders were amalgamated into a single administrative body known as the United Midwayers of Urantia. This amalgamation was a strategic move by the planetary supervisors to streamline spiritual and semi-spiritual work on Urantia, compensating for the gaps in planetary leadership that resulted from the default of the Adamic mission. The United Midwayers currently function as a single corps, numbering 10,992 individuals. This figure represents the combined total of the 9,881 loyal primary midwayers and the 1,111 loyal secondary midwayers who remained faithful following the Lucifer rebellion and the Adamic default. The governance of the United Midwayers is characterized by an alternating leadership system. Since their unification after Pentecost, the Corps has been governed alternately by the senior member of each order. The eldest of the primary order, 123 the First, is a notable figure in this history, having led the loyal forces during the rebellion and later serving as the Governor-General of Urantia. He is currently the only loyal midwayer to have been released from immediate planetary duties, now serving on Jerusalem as one of the 24 counselors. The United Midwayers are organized into 4 specific groups based on their innate endowments and acquired skills to assist the planetary seraphim. Midway Messengers, a small corps tasked with quick and reliable personal communication across the planet. They are especially valuable on an evolutionary world for maintaining liaisons between celestial visitors and the planetary administration. Planetary Sentinels. These beings serve as guardians and observers of the world's space and its invisible spirit realm. They patrol the planet to monitor phenomena and communication types of importance to the supernatural beings of the realm. Contact Personalities. Midwayers are always employed in the contacts made with mortal beings on material worlds. They serve as essential factors in the liaisons between spiritual and material levels, and were the primary agents through whom the Urantia communications were transmitted. Progress Helpers. These are the more spiritual of the midway creatures, distributed as assistants to the various orders of seraphim, who function in special groups on the planet, such as those dedicated to the progress of the mind and spirit. One of the most profound and enduring contributions of the midway creatures to the welfare of Urantia is their role in sponsoring and providing the narrative for the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, which comprises Part 4 of the Urantia Book. This massive project was undertaken by a commission of 12 Urantia midwayers, acting under the supervision of a Melchizedek revelatory director. The narrative for the life of Jesus was not derived from channeled or mystical sources in the way humans often perceive them. Instead, it was prepared using a rigorous methodology that prioritized human sources and concepts whenever they were adequate to express the truth. The primary narrator was a single secondary midwayer who had once been assigned to the superhuman watch care of the Apostle Andrew. This midwayer possessed a first-hand memory of the events of Jesus' life, as witnessed through the lens of one of his closest human associates. The Commission's ruling motive was to create a record that would be enlightening to the present generation and helpful to all future generations. They adjusted verbal expressions to better conform to the real meaning and import of the Master's teachings, yet they remained deeply respectful of the human thought patterns of the first century. By providing the missing 30 years of Jesus' life, including his childhood, adolescent struggles, and family responsibilities, the midwayers have humanized the figure of the Creator Son. Their narrative portrays a personality that is superbly balanced, courageously kind, and profoundly sincere. This work represents the restatement of truth, intended to free humanity from stifling religious traditions and creeds, pointing instead toward a personal and liberating relationship with God.
The pure-line Adamites were, according to the Urantia Book, the unmixed descendants of Adam and Eve. They were a pair of celestial beings called material sons, sent to Earth roughly 37,848 years before 1934 AD to biologically and spiritually uplift humanity. Their bodies radiated a faint violet-hued luminescence, earning them the name the Violet Race, the ninth human race to appear on Urantia, Earth. Over millennia, they grew from a small family of exiles into a population of 4.5 million by 19,000 BC, seeding their genetic and cultural inheritance into nearly every civilization on the planet through peaceful emigration, missionary work, and eventual blending with existing races. Their story, told across papers 73 through 78 of the Urantia Book, is one of cosmic ambition, tragic failure, and enduring legacy. Adam and Eve were not born on Earth. They were members of the senior core of material sons on Jerusalem, the capital world of Earth's local system of inhabited planets called Satania. Jointly numbered 14,311 in that core, they belonged to the third physical series and had served for more than 15,000 years as directors of experimental energy laboratories, modifying living forms and teaching new arrivals. On Jerusalem, they had already raised 100 children, 50 sons and 50 daughters. Their mission arose because Earth's evolutionary races had reached a biological plateau. A supervisor named Morontia inspected the planet and recommended that material sons be sent. The entire senior core of material sons volunteered, and Melchizedek examiners selected this particular Adam and Eve, partly because they had remained loyal during the devastating Lucifer rebellion that had already left Earth isolated and scarred. They were to serve as biological uplifters, multiplying their own superior race into the hundreds of thousands, then gradually interbreeding with humanity to elevate the species from within. The plan demanded patience. Build a pure-line violet population of at least 500,000 to 1 million before any widespread amalgamation. They arrived via seraphic transport at high noon and were rematerialized over 10 days inside a stone temple at the center of a magnificent Garden of Eden, not in Mesopotamia, but on a long, narrow peninsula projecting westward from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. A loyal servant named Van had supervised its construction for years. By Adam's arrival, the garden already boasted 12,000 miles of paved roads, thousands of miles of irrigation ditches, and over 5,000 brick buildings, though it was only 1/4 finished. A great river fed by 4 tributaries watered the peninsula, and encircling mountains gave it a mild, equable climate. At its heart stood the sacred temple of the Universal Father. They stood a little more than 8 feet tall, with blue eyes, fair complexions, and light hair, ranging from yellow to red to brown. But their most striking feature was invisible to no one. Their bodies gave forth a shimmer of violet-hued light. This radiant glow, a consequence of their dual circulation system, sustained by both material food and direct absorption of light energy, is what gave the entire race its name. They typically wore clothing, which largely concealed the luminescence across their bodies, but the glow radiating from their heads remained visible, producing what the Urantia Book identifies as the origin of the traditional halo depicted around holy figures throughout religious art. Their physical senses were far superior to those of evolutionary humans. They could perceive midway creatures and angelic beings invisible to mortal eyes. They possessed a form of telepathy, communicating with their immediate children across distances of about 50 miles through delicate gas chambers near their brain structures. Their bodies were highly disease-resistant, and Eve experienced no pain in childbirth, a trait shared by her pure-line descendants. Their skulls were dolichocephalic, long-headed, a skeletal type that persisted as a distinguishing marker for generations. Adam and Eve were designed to live indefinitely on Earth through access to the Tree of Life, a real Urantia origin shrub that had been maintained for over 150,000 years. Their children, however, did not inherit the dual nutrition system. They were designedly mortal, though long-lived, with each succeeding generation's lifespan gravitating closer to the human norm. After the default severed Adam and Eve from the Tree of Life, Adam himself lived 530 years before dying of old age. Eve died 19 years before him from a weakened heart. Life in the first garden was structured around education, worship, and agriculture. The seventh day was devoted entirely to spiritual life, mornings for physical improvement, noontime for worship at the Father's temple, afternoons for intellectual cultivation, and evenings for social fellowship, a pattern the Urantia Book identifies as the origin of Sabbath observance. Adam and Eve explicitly forbade worship of themselves, insisting all devotion be directed toward the universal Father. Children were educated in schools modeled on Jerusalem methods until age 16, then transferred to practical schools on the garden's western end until age 20. The curriculum covered 7 subjects: health and bodily care, the golden rule as a social standard, individual versus group rights, the history of Earth's races, trade improvement, emotional coordination, and the cultivation of play and humor. Younger children rotated activities every 30 minutes, older students every hour. Adam organized the Edenites into companies of 100, established nearly 100 outlying trade and social centers, and introduced the concept of representative government and diplomatic ambassadors between tribes. Adam and Eve's household was vegetarian. They themselves ate once daily, fruits, nuts, and cereals, and additionally absorbed energy directly from light. Their first generation ate no flesh whatsoever, subsisting entirely on the fruits of the trees. Later generations incorporated dairy products, though many continued plant-based diets. Eve nourished children with nut milks and fruit juices after weaning them at 1 year. Before the default, Eve bore 63 children, 32 daughters and 31 sons. By the time the family left the garden, 4 generations of pure line descendants numbered 1,647 individuals. The firstborn, Adamson, and the second son, Eveson, became the pillars of Adamite civilization. Average betrothal age was 18, with marriage permitted at 20. After more than a century of effort, progress was agonizingly slow. The world's evolutionary races were fragmented across hundreds of dialects, morally undeveloped, and scattered across vast distances. Caligastia, the deposed but still active planetary prince who had joined the Lucifer rebellion, worked ceaselessly to undermine the mission. Unable to influence Adam directly, he targeted Eve through an unwitting intermediary, Seraphic, a brilliant and sincere Nodite leader who had become one of Adam's most trusted lieutenants. Over 5 years of secret planning, Seraphic convinced Eve that mating with the Nodite leader Kano would produce a mixed-heritage child capable of immediately bridging the Violet and Nodite peoples, accelerating the mission by centuries. One autumn twilight, Eve consented. This act, pursuing a righteous end through unauthorized means, constituted the Adamic default, a departure from the divine plan. When Adam learned what had happened, he deliberately committed the same transgression with the Nodite woman Lauta, choosing to share Eve's fate rather than face an eternity without her. The seraphim Salonia, the narrator of these papers and literally the voice in the garden, reproved them both. Gabriel pronounced formal judgment. Adam and Eve were stripped of their immortal status and reduced to mortal standing. The consequences were immediate and violent. Cana was killed when garden dwellers swept out and destroyed the nearby Nodite settlement. Serapatatia drowned himself. Eve bore Cain, fathered by Cano, and Adam fathered Sansa by Lauta, who died in childbirth. Faced with a Nodite army marching on the garden, Adam chose to leave peacefully. Seraphic transports carried children under 20 to the constellation capital of Urantia. Adam, Eve, and 1,200 loyal followers departed eastward. The caravan journeyed for nearly a full year to reach a triangle of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, one of the original 3 candidate sites for the garden. There, a defense wall of 56 miles was constructed across the northern approach. Unlike the first garden, everything here had to be built from scratch, by the labor of their own hands and in the sweat of their faces. Adam devoted his remaining centuries to training his descendants in civil administration, education, and religious devotion. His son Eveson became his chief administrator. Eveson's eldest son, Jansad, succeeded Adam as head of the Adamite tribes. The religious lineage passed through Seth, the eldest surviving son, born in the second garden, 129 years after Adam's arrival, whose son Enos founded a new order of worship, and whose grandson Kenan launched the first foreign missionary service to surrounding tribes, establishing a Sethite priesthood that combined religion, healthcare, and education. The Adamites produced a third alphabet, pioneered metalworking, pottery, and weaving, and laid the foundations of art, science, and literature that would ripple outward for millennia. The Second Eden became the cradle of civilization for almost 30,000 years. Before Adam's death, he took one last extraordinary step. Eve was made head of a commission of 12 charged with race improvement, which selected 1,682 women of the highest type on Earth to be impregnated with Adamic life plasm. Of the resulting children, 1,570 survived to maturity, the earliest seeds of a new blended people. By 19,000 BC, the Adamites numbered 4.5 million and had already sent millions of their progeny outward as teachers, traders, and settlers. The purer strains maintained a deep tradition of peace-seeking. When population pressures mounted, they sent their finest sons and daughters as emissaries rather than as conquerors. Around the periphery of the second garden, where diminishing concentrations of violet blood blended with nodite and evolutionary peoples, a new race emerged, the Andites. Carrying roughly 1/8 to 1/6 Adamic inheritance, the Andites combined the intellectual and spiritual gifts of the violet race with the vigor and belligerence of the Nodites. The Urantia Book calls them the best all-round human stock to appear on Urantia since the days of the pure-line violet peoples. They were, critically, not Aryan but pre-Aryan, not white but pre-white. Neither Occidental nor Oriental, but a blended foundation from which later racial categories would develop.
The Andite migrations reshaped the planet over 15,000 years. The major waves moved northward around the Caspian Sea and then westward into Europe, where they merged with the indigenous blue race to form the foundation of what the Urantia Book calls the Nordic peoples, forefathers of the Scandinavian, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon populations. 7 distinct Andite invasions of Europe are recorded, the last arriving on horseback in the 6th and 7th millennia BC. Eastward, Andites penetrated India as the Dravidian and later Aryan conquerors, making India the only location where all of Urantia's races eventually blended. They entered China via the Tibetan highlands and the Ti-Tao Pass, strengthening northern Chinese civilization, which the Urantia Book identifies as hosting the highest mass civilization on Urantia, between 25,000 and 5,000 BC.
A remarkable group of 132 Andites embarked from Japan in small boats, crossed the Pacific via Polynesian islands, and reached South America, where they became ancestors of the Inca ruling lineage. Easter Island served as a religious center for one of these lost Pacific groups. In the homeland, the last Andites in Mesopotamia became the Sumerians, explaining the apparently sudden appearance of their advanced civilization, complete with temples, metalworking, writing, and complex law. By 2500 BC, the Sumerians were absorbed into northern Semitic peoples, and the Mesopotamian Andites passed from the pages of history. Along the Nile, Andite artisans brought metalworking and stone architecture. The Urantia Book credits the Andite genius Imhotep with constructing Egypt's first and most exquisite stone pyramid. The Urantia Book presents the Adamic mission as a partial failure that nonetheless enormously upstepped humanity. The narrator insists there was no fall of man, only a tragic shortcut that truncated a grander plan. Modern humans, even the northern European populations with the highest concentrations, carry far less than 1/8 violet blood, yet the Adamic contribution persists in 4 interwoven strands that compose the most advanced human stocks: Andinite, Sangic, Nodite, and Adamic. The cultural legacy runs deeper than genetics. The concept of the Sabbath, the halo in religious art, monotheistic worship, representative government, diplomatic exchange, formal education systems, the cultivation of humor and play, agricultural science, metalworking, alphabetic writing, and the missionary impulse. The Urantia Book traces all of these, in some measure, to the civilization that began with 2 8-foot-tall beings who stepped out of seraphic transport into a Mediterranean garden nearly 40,000 years ago, failed spectacularly, picked themselves up, walked to Mesopotamia, and spent the rest of their mortal lives trying to give humanity everything they had left to give. The violet shimmer faded, the inheritance endured. The Urmia lectures are presented in the Urantia Book, paper 134, The Transition Years, as a concentrated, unusually formal teaching cycle delivered during Jesus' caravan trip to the Caspian Sea in April 1 AD 24 to April 1 AD 25. The text narrates that Jesus served as caravan conductor for a year-long journey that routed, as described, from Jerusalem via a chain of regions to the Caspian Sea, and on the return he relinquished caravan command at Lake Urmia, staying slightly over 2 weeks. Paper 134 then situates an interreligious temple of the philosophy of religions on an island near Urmia, where a wealthy merchant named Simboiton and his sons host scheduled multi-faith lectures, discussions, and evening debates. Jesus first participates informally, then agrees to return to deliver 24 lectures on the brotherhood of men, plus 12 evening sessions of Q&A/debate. The text stresses that this Urmia cycle is portrayed as the most systematic single-subject teaching episode attributed to Jesus in the book, explicitly reframing the theme as the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of men. Paper 134 frames the Urmia episode within a transition period after a wider travel phase, describing a return to Galilee and family matters, then a full year away as caravan conductor. The text says that while preparing to leave Nazareth, Jesus took the place of an ill caravan conductor, Anticipating a year-long absence, he convened a family meeting and arranged for his mother and youngest sister to move to Capernaum. The caravan journey is dated precisely, the 1st of April AD 24. The described route states that the caravan was going from Jerusalem by way of Damascus and Lake Urmia through Assyria, Media, and Parthia to the southeastern Caspian Sea region, and that it took a full year until return.
Paper 134 emphasizes the experiential dimension. Jesus is portrayed not only as a traveler, but as an executive responsible for goods, safety, and management of passengers, guards, and camel drivers, with the trip characterized as both exploration and personal ministry. On the outward leg, Jesus is said to have stopped several days at Urmia for recuperation. The narrative locates a lecture amphitheater on a nearby island and describes it as dedicated to the spirit of religion and functioning as a temple of the philosophy of religions.
Symboiton is introduced as a wealthy merchant citizen who built this temple with his 3 sons. The founder is said to have lived and died without revealing his own personal religious beliefs, an internal narrative detail that frames the institution as structurally pluralist and procedurally tolerant. The daily rhythm is described with unusual specificity: 10 a.m. morning lectures, 3 p.m. afternoons, 8 p.m. evening debates, and the site is described as hosting many traditions, more than 30 religions and religious cults, roughly 75 teachers, cottage living arrangements, and periodic rotation by lot at each new moon. The system includes a hard enforcement mechanism. Intolerance or disruptive contentiousness brings prompt and summary dismissal. Within the Urantia narrative, the Urmia institution functions as a microcosm for interreligious encounter. It is explicitly multi-tradition in staffing, requires a minimal theological condition, recognition of a supreme deity, and neutralizes conflict through strict anti-intolerance enforcement and rotating membership. Textually, this resembles an idealized controlled environment for demonstrating A, how plural communities might handle doctrinal difference without coercion, and B, how Jesus, presented as an independent teacher, can articulate a unifying frame without establishing sectarian dominance. The text claims that Jesus participated in discussions during the first stop. Then, before departing Urmia, Symboiton arranged a return sojourn, 2 weeks to deliver 24 lectures on the Brotherhood of Men, plus 12 evening sessions specifically dedicated to discussion and debate. On the return journey from the Caspian region, paper 134 states that Jesus gave up the direction of the caravan at Lake Urmia, remained slightly over 2 weeks, then continued as a passenger with a later caravan to Damascus and onward to Capernaum, arriving April 1 AD 25. Paper 134 explicitly elevates this episode. It calls the Urmia lectures the most systematic and formal of Jesus' teaching on Urantia and asserts he never before or after spoke so extensively on one topic. It then reframes the topic as not merely brotherhood, but the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of men. Immediately following the narrative setup, paper 134 inserts a bracketed editorial note describing how the Urmia teachings were produced for the revelation. The book explicitly tells the reader that an initial summary of the Urmia teachings caused a dispute among celestial administrators, and that the published version is an adaptation by 3 secondary midwayers under further oversight by a Melchizedek chair. It claims that midwayers first summarized the teachings, but disagreements between seraphim of the churches and seraphim of progress led to commissioning 3 secondary midwayers to adapt the teachings to 20th century contexts under a Melchizedek chair's editorial oversight. This creates a layered authority model. 1, an asserted historical teaching event. 2, a midwayer summary. 3, a later midwayer restatement. 4, Melchizedek editing. And 5, an explicit aim to apply teachings to 20th century religious political conditions. The ensuing sections, sovereignty, divine and human, political sovereignty, and law, liberty, and sovereignty, articulate a structured argument. Religious peace depends on acknowledging God's spiritual sovereignty. Political peace depends on transcending unlimited national sovereignty toward a representative world government. Liberty depends on enforceable law and bounded freedom. The Urmia teaching content argues that religious peace cannot exist if religions claim exclusive ecclesiastical sovereignty. Peace requires surrendering spiritual sovereignty to God alone. This is presented as a structural diagnosis. Attempts by any religion to assert superiority will generate intolerance and persecution. Paper 134 explicitly defines brotherhood as grounded in the fatherhood of God and defines the kingdom of heaven as a spiritual relationship between God and humanity, framing unity as spiritual rather than institutional uniformity. This is doctrinally significant inside the Urantia framework because it ties social ethics, brotherhood, to metaphysics, God as spirit, and to anthropology, a fragment of God's spirit indwelling humans, producing an equality claim that cuts across caste, class, and economic status. The paper uses the Urmia school itself as a worked example. The religionists are said to live in comparative peace because they surrender spiritual sovereignty while maintaining a strong social authority structure in Symboyton's presidency. Doctrinally, this is one of the Urmia lecture's most distinctive contributions relative to many traditional exclusivist religious models. It advances a strong pluralist ecumenical thesis while still requiring theism, some sort of supreme deity, as a boundary condition for participation. The text's political sovereignty argument is blunt. War will not end while nations cling to unlimited national sovereignty, and lasting peace requires surrender of war-making power to a representative global government. The content includes explicit modern illustrations, the American Federal Union, the 48 states, and explicit forward-looking claims, global regulation of money and trade, possible global language, possibility of global religions. Textually, the paper itself marks these passages as particularly adapted. It states that, because political life has evolved dramatically since Jesus' time, the presentation departed more widely from the substance of the Master's teachings, while aiming to depict the import of those teachings for the 20th century. The doctrinal significance inside Urantia theology is that brotherhood is treated as a two-level project. Religion underwrites spiritual unity, but governance structures are required to operationalize social, economic, political stability, mankind government. Jesus departed Urmia at the close of his 2-week sojourn, traveling westward as a passenger on a later caravan to Damascus, then on to Capernaum. He never returned to Urmia. After the death of Symboyton, his sons encountered growing difficulties maintaining a peaceful faculty. Symboyton's eldest son appealed to Abner at Philadelphia for help. Abner's choice of Christian teachers was unfortunate. They proved unyielding and uncompromising, seeking to make their religion dominant over all others. Critically, they never suspected that the oft-cited lectures of the caravan conductor had been delivered by Jesus himself. As confusion and contention increased, the 3 brothers withdrew their financial support. The school closed after 5 years. Later, it was reopened as a Mithric temple and eventually burned down in connection with one of their orgiastic celebrations. Theologically, this functions as a cautionary tale about institutional capture. When a group tries to make its religion dominant, the pluralist equilibrium collapses. As narrative rhetoric, it reinforces the Urmia lecture's core anti-supremacist thesis.
The Urantia Book presents the Lucifer Rebellion as a system-wide ideological secession led by Lucifer, the system sovereign of Satania, and advanced through a declaration of liberty that reframes liberty as self-assertion, contests universe authority, and attacks the Ascension training program for evolutionary mortals. The narrative emphasizes that the root cause is ultimately located in Lucifer's own mind and pride, while also stating that the exact causes cannot be fully pinpointed. Chronologically, the open proclamation of the Lucifer Declaration of Liberty is dated to about 200,000 years ago Urantia time, at an annual conclave on the Sea of Glass on Jerusalem. The rebellion drew in a portion of system leadership, notably 37 planetary princes, triggered quarantine or isolation procedures, and unfolded as a war in heaven that is explicitly non-physical, fought in terms of life eternal, persuasion, loyalty, and moral choosing, rather than bodily combat.
Urantia's planetary crisis is framed as a direct derivative of this system rebellion. Caligastia, Urantia's planetary prince, pre-consented to betrayal after being briefed by Satan, then attempted to seize sovereignty. The Urantia Book describes 7 crucial years in which loyalists, Van and the modified mortal Amidon, with loyal midwayers and seraphic support, resisted while system and planetary circuits were severed. Post-rebellion Urantia enters a prolonged probationary rehabilitation regime and a complex supervisory arrangement, Most High Observer, Resident Governor-General, and special commissions, while the larger Satania case remains pending final adjudication in super-universe courts. In its theological framing, the Urantia Book repeatedly uses the rebellion to interpret questions of free will, mercy, and justice, especially why rebellious leaders were not immediately destroyed. It argues for time lags as mercy-serving intervals that protect creature free will and allow full clarification of moral choices, while also noting that a first hearing in the case Gabriel versus Lucifer had begun on Uversa at the time of the revelations, and that subsequent restrictions, including Satan's confinement, followed.
Lucifer is described as a brilliant primary Lananandek son of Nebadon, distinguished for administrative ability, who became the system sovereign of Satania, ruling from Jerusalem over a system of 607 inhabited worlds. The text frames his later rebellion as an embrace of sin via a sophistry of spurious personal liberty, and it places the Satania event among only 3 such system sovereign failures in Nebadon's history. After Lucifer and his first assistant, Satan, had reigned for more than 500,000 years, they began to internally array themselves against the Universal Father and his then vicegerent son, Michael. The account explicitly denies that external conditions forced rebellion and instead asserts that the idea was not suggested to Lucifer by others. It originated in Lucifer's own mind, developing through self-assertion, internal dissatisfaction, and eventual open disloyalty. For more than 100 years of standard time, the Union of Days on Salvington reportedly communicated to Uversa that all was not well in Lucifer's mind, and this was also communicated to Michael and to the constellation leadership. Just days before the public proclamation, Gabriel's visit to Jerusalem confronted Lucifer's first overt expression of disloyalty. Gabriel then consulted Urantia leadership regarding prospective open rebellion.
The narrative states that it is very difficult to identify the exact cause or causes culminating in rebellion, insisting only that its beginnings were in Lucifer's mind and that pride nourished self-deception. Over time, Lucifer's trajectory is described as shifting from pride-driven error into deliberate sin, with mercy opportunities offered, including through Faithful of Days interventions presenting Michael's plan and repeatedly rejected by the principal leaders. Separate Urantia narratives locate Caligastia's arrival on Urantia about 500,000 years ago, concurrent with the appearance of the Sangic races. In a general framing of planetary prince epics, the text emphasizes that on Urantia, early in the planetary prince regime, Caligastia cast his lot with the rebellion of the system's sovereign Lucifer, and that the planet pursued a stormy course thereafter. The outbreak is crystallized in the Lucifer Declaration of Liberty, framed under three heads. Number 1, denial of the reality of the universal Father and reinterpreting gravity and energy as inherent while treating the Father as a myth enabling Paradise Sun rule. Number 2, repudiation of Michael's authority to assume sovereignty in the Father's name and opposition to super-universe interference by the Ancients of Days. Number 3, an attack on the morality and purpose of the Ascension training program for mortals, casting it as exploitative and fictional. This declaration is presented as the ideological engine that launches the rebellion.
The manifesto is issued at the annual conclave of Satania on Jerusalem's Sea of Glass about 200,000 years ago, Urantia time, with Satan proclaiming that worship might be accorded universal forces, but allegiance belongs to Lucifer as present ruler. The rebellion's battle cry is self-assertion, paired with arguments for equality of mind and locally bounded government. Lucifer promises planetary princes supreme executive rule and organizes alternative legislative and judicial structures under rebel jurisdiction. The system cabinet joins Lucifer in a body, establishing a new administration of liberated worlds and systems. The narrative also depicts Lucifer using the lack of immediate punitive action, mercy delays, as evidence of governmental impotence, while Gabriel publicly maintains that loyalty is to remain voluntary and sophistry-proof. At outbreak, Michael consults Emmanuel and announces non-interference as policy. A key cosmological legal claim is that, at the time of this rebellion, there was no absolute and personal sovereign authority in Nebadon because Michael had not completed his bestowal career and had not yet been vested with unqualified sovereignty. Accordingly, the narrative frames a long period in which rebels are allowed to run a free course from outbreak until Michael's enthronement as sovereign, almost 200,000 years of Urantia time. In operational terms, Gabriel assumes command of loyal hosts, symbolically presenting Michael's banner. The conflict is then explicitly defined as non-physical, centered on argument, exposure of sophistries, and moral decision among personalities. The war is nevertheless described as very terrible and very real, fought in terms of eternal survival rather than bodily injury.
The rebellion is system-wide. 37 planetary princes swing their administrations to Lucifer, with Panoptia singled out as a world whose people remain loyal under Melchizedek guidance. Interplanetary communications are suspended. The Satania system is isolated in constellation and universe circuits, with messages carried only by agents such as seraphim and solitary messengers. The text itemizes significant losses among lower orders, seraphim, associated cherubim, material sons, and midway creatures, while emphasizing that no Jerusalem resident ascendant mortals participate in the rebellion. After over 2 years of system time from the beginning of the war in heaven, Lucifer's successor arrives and is installed. This event is marked by administrative stabilization and by dethroning the rebels from governing power. However, the text says no local universe tribunal could then detain or destroy Lucifer, because Michael was not yet a sovereign ruler. Thus, Lucifer and associates are allowed for a time to roam Jerusalem and even individual worlds, continuing efforts of deception, although no new worlds are lost during this period. Later descriptions identify the present system sovereign as Laniforge, successor to the apostate Lucifer, and characterize continuing emergency administrative arrangements in Satania as an expanded staff made necessary by the rebellion. Urantia's betrayal is framed as premeditated. After Caligastia has governed Urantia for 300,000 years, Satan arrives on a periodic inspection and informs Caligastia of Lucifer's proposed declaration of liberty. Caligastia agrees to betray Urantia upon announcement. Shortly after, Caligastia attempts a political seizure, proclaiming himself absolute sovereign and demanding council abdication. Van objects and seeks appeal to Jerusalem, and orders return designating Caligastia as supreme sovereign while demanding allegiance. Urantia then experiences abrupt isolation as system circuits are severed, forcing all present celestial groups into a decision between loyalty and rebellion. Elsewhere, the Urantia Book names the tertiary universe circuit supervisor, Ondavantia, as the one who isolated Urantia at the time of the betrayal during the testing seasons of the Lucifer rebellion. For more than 7 years, Urantia undergoes the crisis while personalities make final decisions before higher authorities intervene. The text describes a loyal settlement protected by loyal midwayers and connected to custody of the Tree of Life, reserved for loyal staff and associates. Among the internal heroes, Amadon is named as the outstanding human hero of the Lucifer rebellion, steadfast alongside Van against Caligastia's sophistries, and this loyalty is framed as spiritually decisive despite limited intellectual advantage. Once the last decision is made, a Most High and emergency Melchizedeks arrive to seize authority and inaugurate a probationary rehabilitation era.
Post-rebellion, Urantia's administrative cultural systems collapse. Confusion near Dalmatia persists for decades, and a catastrophic inundation occurs 162 years after the rebellion, submerging the planetary headquarters and obliterating much cultural progress. The narrative also traces long-term governance by Melchizedek receivers and the continuing work of Van and Amadon until the Adamic era, describing prolonged rehabilitation and scattered civilized outposts. In paper 66's retrospective, Caligastia is described as having been warned, having gone into darkness at the time of the Lucifer rebellion, and as later having his authority progressively curtailed, especially by Machiventa's incarnation and finally by Michael's life in the flesh. The text denies that a personal devil could coerce normal human minds against free will. The Urantia Book connects the decisive systemic turning point to Michael's mortal bestowal. It states that Lucifer and Satan roamed Satania until the completion of Michael's bestowal mission, and that they were last on Urantia during their combined assault on the Son of Man. A detailed episode places a climactic universe trial near the end of Jesus' Mount Hermon sojourn. Satan, representing Lucifer, and Caligastia appear, making proposals centered on universe sovereignty rather than physical temptations. Jesus refuses compromise and commits judgment to the Ancients of Days. The text then asserts that when Jesus descended from Mount Hermon, the Lucifer rebellion in Satania and the Caligastia secession on Urantia were virtually settled, with Michael's sovereignty acquisition enabling future rebellions to be handled summarily. In Paper 53's framing, the bestowal terminated the Lucifer rebellion in all Satania aside from the planets of the apostate planetary princes.
After Michael becomes the settled head of Nebadon, Lucifer is taken into custody and confined to prison worlds, while Caligastia remains on Urantia, but is described as unable to invade minds or souls without consent or desire. Michael petitions the Ancients of Days to intern all personalities concerned pending rulings in Gabriel versus Lucifer, said to have been placed on Uversa's records almost 200,000 years ago. The petition is granted with an exception allowing Satan periodic visits to apostate princes until adjudication begins. At the time of the revelations, the text reports that a first hearing has occurred on Uversa and that a mandate follows confining Satan to prison worlds, ending Satan's visits to fallen worlds. The system circuits are stated to remain unreinstated so long as Lucifer lives, with final disposition awaiting super-universe decree. Within Urantia-specific governance, the world remains supervised through layered regimes influenced by rebellion conditions, including Most High observers in commissions, and some statements explicitly anticipate that changes may occur at the final adjudication of the Lucifer rebellion.
According to the Urantia Book, the lineage of the fondors can be traced back to the early Cenozoic era. Around 45 million years ago, during the Eocene period, a large ostrich-like land bird evolved on Urantia, standing about 10 feet tall and laying massive eggs roughly 9 by 13 inches in size. These giant flightless birds were the ancestors of the later gigantic passenger birds, the fondors, that would eventually take to the skies. Over ensuing epochs, as mammals and other life forms advanced, these avian ancestors gave rise to true flying wonder birds capable of supporting the weight of human beings in flight. By the time primitive humans appeared, enormous flying birds had developed, and early people would come to tame and ride these creatures. The fondors are presented as a unique feature of Urantia's prehistorical fauna. They flourished through the ages when large animals dominated, surviving into the era of human evolution. When mortal-will creatures, primitive humans, emerged and began forming early societies, the stage was set for the utilization of these great birds. The Urantia Book notes that early evolutionary man learned to make extensive use of the larger flying animals, implying that by the time of primitive human tribes, the fondor, or its analogues, were present and available for domestication. Fondors thus represent an evolutionary success, a colossal avian species that not only attained flight, but also a level of intelligence and tameness that allowed close interaction with humans. Fondors played a significant role in the early history of human civilization on Urantia. They are first mentioned in the context of the planetary princes era, long before modern recorded history. Around 500,000 years ago, when Prince Caligastia's staff established a primitive society at Dalmatia, the fondors were integrated into human use. The prince's corporeal staff included a division known as the Board of Animal Domestication and Utilization, led by an expert named Bon. Bon's group successfully trained the great fondors as passenger birds, essentially introducing aviation to the primitive world. In those days, early humans were taught to domesticate various animals for food, labor, and travel. Dogs had long been human companions, and cattle and elephants were being tamed. The fondors, however, were a revolutionary addition. The training of these great fondors allowed people to travel through the air, riding on the backs of the huge birds. This development provided an unprecedented vantage point and mobility in an age where even the wheel was a new invention. Indeed, the Urantia Book notes that it was during this period that carrier pigeons were also first used for communication, while fondors were used to carry passengers. Together, These innovations greatly expanded the range of human communication and transport. For the early races of Urantia, fondors became an invaluable resource. The text implies that primitive tribes made extensive use of these large flying animals in their daily life. A person could fly to distant locations in a matter of hours, covering in one trip what might have taken many days on foot. This likely facilitated cultural exchange and coordination among far-flung settlements of early humans. Your early ancestors enjoyed their services, the book remarks, underscoring that the use of fondors was a familiar reality to those ancient peoples. We might imagine messenger riders flying between tribal villages, or scouts surveying new lands from the air, activities otherwise impossible in that era. In the Garden of Eden period, 38,000 years ago, fondors were still present and serving humanity. Adam and Eve, the material son and daughter who arrived on Urantia as biologic uplifters, found fondors in use when they assumed leadership of the world. On the third day after their arrival in Eden, Adam and Eve toured the entire garden by riding on the large passenger birds. From aloft on the backs of the large passenger birds, the fondors, the pair looked down upon the vast stretches of the garden as they were carried through the air over Eden's beautiful landscape. This aerial survey gave them a comprehensive view of their new domain in a single day, something that would have been impractical by ground travel. Not long after the Adam and Eve era, the fortunes of the fondors waned. The text does not detail the cause of their extinction, but it emphasizes that by a bit over 30,000 years ago, the species had died out. This suggests that within a few millennia after Adam and Eve, no fondors remained. Their disappearance might have coincided with climatic shifts, the last ice age glaciations, or perhaps the turmoil and warfare that followed the default of Adam and Eve and the breakup of early civilization. Whatever the cause, later generations of humans were deprived of these living airplanes. By the time of historical record, mankind had no memory of riding giant birds, making the fondors' existence a lost chapter of prehistory preserved only in the Urantia Book's account. Finally, it is worth noting the legacy of the fondors and their riders. While modern mankind has no direct memory of ever riding on the back of a giant bird, the concept does spark the imagination, and the Urantia Book suggests it was a literal reality in our distant past. In the narrative of Urantia's development, fondors and their daring riders played a transitional role. They bridged the gap between the ground-bound life of early humans and the future age of mechanical flight. They allowed humans to experience the sensation of flying and to shrink the distances between tribes long before technology provided similar capabilities. In the universe at large, such partnerships are not unheard of. Even on advanced worlds like Jerusalem, transport birds carry material beings who cannot themselves fly. Thus, the image of a human rider astride a mighty winged creature is part of the cosmic tapestry of evolutionary worlds. On Urantia, that chapter closed millennia ago with the extinction of the fondors. But through the accounts in the Urantia Book, we have a detailed glimpse of these fantastic creatures and the people who rode them. A vision of Stone Age aviators flying on loyal feathered giants, surveying primeval forests and fertile plains from the sky.
Urmia is described in the Urantia Book as the great spiritual leader and enlightener of the indigo races on ancient Urantia. In the early isolation of the African continent, the indigo peoples made little advancement until the days of Urmia, when they experienced a great spiritual awakening. Urmia taught these tribes the worship of a supreme deity whom he called the God of Gods. Under his leadership, the indigo race was inspired to seek this highest God above all others. This marked a profound spiritual awakening for a people who had previously languished in cultural stagnation. Urmia's ministry had a lasting, though fading, impact on the indigo peoples.
The Urantia Book notes that while later generations almost entirely forgot the god of gods proclaimed by Orvenon, they did not entirely lose the desire to worship the unknown. In fact, the reverence for an unseen, ultimate god persisted in Africa as a form of primitive worship for tens of thousands of years after Orvenon's time. At least they maintained a form of worship up to a few thousand years ago. This suggests that Orvenon's legacy was the planting of an enduring seed of faith in a single ultimate deity among the Indigo tribes, even though the details of his teaching eventually degenerated into vague tradition. Importantly, Orvenon is one of a handful of extraordinary teachers from Urantia's prehistory who markedly influenced and inspired a whole race. The book explains that it only mentions such outstanding leaders like Orvenon because collectively those saving influences prevented the total collapse of cultural civilization during the long ages of darkness between the planetary rebellion and the later Adamic epoch. In Orvenon's case, his spiritual leadership kept alive the concept of a supreme god and the practice of worship among the African populations, mitigating spiritual loss even as material progress remained limited.
One distinctive aspect of Orvenon's ministry was his reference to the Creator as the God of Gods. This phrase signifies that he taught the Indigo race about one ultimate God who reigns above all lesser gods. According to the account, Orvenon proclaimed this God of Gods to his people, leading them away from crude superstition and toward a form of primitive monotheism. Even though much of Orvenon's doctrine was later forgotten, the Urantia Book emphasizes that the yearning to worship a higher deity, an unknown god beyond their former nature-fear deities, remained as a direct result of Orvenon's influence. In Urantia Book terms, Orvenon's introduction of the God of Gods was a crucial step in uplifting the spiritual consciousness of the Indigo race, fostering the idea of a singular divine authority in a culture that had known only fear of natural forces and multiple spirits. In recognition of his significance, Orvenon's destiny after his earthly life included appointment to a high honor. He became one of the 24 planetary counselors on Urusum, the headquarters world of our local system. According to the Urantia Book, these 24 counselors were assembled by the authority of Michael of Nebadon, Christ, after his final bestowal on Urantia. Around 1900 years ago, shortly after Jesus' departure from Earth, the 24 surrounding seats were placed in position on Urusum, creating a special advisory body of human personalities to represent Urantia's interests. The Urantia Book explains that these 24 counselors have been recruited from the 8 Urantia races, comprising the most outstanding spiritual leaders of each lineage and epoch of Urantia's history. They serve as personal agents of the Sovereign Son, Christ Michael, in system affairs, especially concerning the mortals of the isolated worlds. Orvenon is explicitly named in this distinguished group. He is listed as number 8 of the 24 counselors, described as Orvenon, the enlightener of the Indigo races, and their leader in the one-time service of the God of Gods. This title encapsulates his earthly role, guiding the black race in the worship of the one God. Being included among the Jerusalem 24 signifies that Orvenon achieved a level of spiritual progress and leadership recognized by the universe administrators. Alongside other luminaries such as Onagar, the earliest teacher of primitive man, Mansant, a post-rebellion teacher, Onamanalantan, leader of the Red Race, and even Adam and Eve, Orvenon's wisdom and service were deemed vital to Urantia's spiritual heritage. His presence on this council means that he continues to serve Urantia's spiritual progress from Urusum, helping administer and advise on the planetary resurrection and ascension plans on behalf of Christ Michael.
After the sorrow of the default, after the long shadow that fell across the second garden, there remained on Urantia a quiet and stubborn faith that the divine plan had not been abandoned. Adam and Eve had failed in part, but they had not failed in purpose. Their children grew into adulthood under the weight of a broken promise and the strange dignity of a mission unfinished. Among those children was Adamson, the firstborn son, and unlike those who would later be taken away to the system worlds, Adamson stayed. He grew up inside the tension that defined early post-default Urantia, the presence of higher ideals and the pressure of a confused planet. He saw how the violet inheritance could be diluted, mocked, misunderstood, or misused. He watched leaders rise and fall, families fracture, and the human struggle continue with little outward sign that the garden had ever been meant to change the world. And then something older began to call him. There were legends, held quietly in the memory of Van and Amadon and preserved among the more faithful lines, of a highland refuge to the north, a place that remembered, a region where remnants of the earlier planetary stories still lingered. Adamson's heart turned toward that rumor like iron toward a magnet. He was not merely curious, he was compelled, as though the planet itself still held a hidden assignment for him. So Adamson left the second garden and went north. It was not a simple journey. The distances were great, and the world beyond the garden was not a garden at all. It was a living mixture of tribal humanity, nodite remnants, and older Adamic stocks scattered across hard country. Yet Adamson persisted, and he did not go alone. A small company chose to follow him, a deliberate band of seekers and builders who believed there was still a future for the Violet mission on Urantia. They traveled for years. When they finally reached the highland region east of the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, near the Kopet Dag mountain belt and the fertile margins that border the harsher lands, Adamson found more than a location. He found a living thread of the planet's earlier history. And there, he encountered the woman who would define his destiny, and through him shape a long chapter of Urantia's hidden development. Her name was Rata. She claimed to be the last pure-line descendant of the prince's staff, a surviving flower of an old and nearly vanished lineage. Whether others believed it fully at first or not, Adamson recognized something in her that matched the gravity of the moment. Her mind carried a different kind of memory. Her presence carried a kind of continuity. Where Adamson brought the violet strain and the dream of a renewed world, Rata brought the deep roots of earlier planetary administration, a residue of discipline and instruction that had been preserved through hardship and time. Their union was not merely romantic. It was strategic in the highest sense of the word, a joining of two streams that had once been meant to serve the planet together. They married, and from them came an astonishing family. The Urantia Book describes them as having 67 children, an expanding household that became a tribe, then a people, then the seed of a civilization. But the story does not stop at a large family. The book makes a claim that changes everything about how the Adamsonites should be understood. Every fourth child, it says, was of a unique order. Not merely gifted, not merely brilliant, unique in kind, often invisible, a class of offspring that did not fit ordinary categories of moral life. Adamson and Rata recognized what they were dealing with, and they did not treat these children as curiosities or accidents. They organized them, they paired them, and from their union came the secondary order of midwayers, a vast core of helpers that multiplied into almost 2,000 within a century. In this way, the Adamsonite story becomes more than a racial or cultural narrative. It becomes an administrative and planetary narrative, a story of unseen assistance, of an invisible workforce dedicated to the preservation and advancement of higher truth on a confused world. With such helpers, the Adamsonites could do what many other peoples could not. They could sustain continuity. They could carry forward lessons over generations without losing the thread. They could preserve traditions and apply discipline in ways that resisted the usual decay of culture. They could build, teach, organize, and recover from shocks. Their headquarters became a northern center of the Violet Legacy, distinct from the Adamite center in Mesopotamia. For thousands of years, the Adamsonites maintained a high culture.
The Urantia Book frames their civilization as enduring for nearly 7,000 years from the time of Adamson and Rata. In the long timescales of early humanity, that is not a brief golden age. That is a sustained experiment in preserving higher standards across a turbulent epoch. Their society carried ideals of order, advanced living, and elevated teaching, aided by those extraordinary secondary midwayers and supported by the blending of two historic lineages. Yet even this culture did not remain pure. Time always demands mixing. Border peoples intermarry. New conditions press in. The Adamsonites became admixed with neighboring Nodites and Andanites, and the book says they were numbered among the mighty men of old. That phrase is more than a compliment. It is a marker that their presence became part of broader human legend. Their strength and stature and leadership became remembered, retold, and reshaped into myth.
And as their culture diversified, different centers and waves of development arose among their descendants. The book describes 4 distinct cultures arising in the Adamsonite region over time, fostered by different groups of Adamson's posterity. It is as though the original impulse of Adamson and Rata kept throwing off new attempts at civilization, each shaped by the pressures and opportunities of its era. Some of these descendants moved. They did not stay confined to the Caspian highlands. They were part of the larger story of migrations that the Urantia Book attributes to the mixed Andite expansions and the spreading of post-Adamic influences across Eurasia. The Adamsonite story, therefore, is not a closed circle. It is a river that sends tributaries into many lands. One of the most dramatic of these tributaries flows toward Greece.
The Urantia Book describes a movement in which a group of tall descendants of Adamson traveled from island to island into the Greek peninsula, led by a man named Sato, described as a direct descendant of Adamson and Rata. This group is presented as selected and superior, a final flowering of a particular Adamsonite civilization stream. The book even gives the number, 375, as though it wants the reader to see this not as vague legend, but as a deliberate transplanting of a people. In the book's framing, this migration becomes part of the hidden ancestry behind the Greek genius, the art, the myth-making, the cultural radiance, not as a denial of Greek creativity, but as a suggested root beneath it. The old Greek stories of divine ancestry, the sense that heroes were born from gods, are interpreted as echoes of a dim and transmuted memory that a higher lineage once entered their world.
Another tributary flows into language itself. The Urantia Book makes the striking claim that the so-called Aryan mother tongue formed in Turkestan through a blending that included the language of the Adamsonites. The idea is that as Adamic dialects, Adamsonite speech, and later Andite influences mixed, a linguistic foundation emerged that spread across large regions, giving modern Occidental languages a family resemblance. Whether one reads this as literal history, symbolic framing, or revelatory interpretation, the book places Adamsonites as contributors, not only to blood and culture, but to the very patterns of human speech. And there is even a technological detail, small but vivid, like a nail that pins the story into the everyday world.
The Urantia Book attributes the discovery of bronze, the blending of copper with tin, to an Adamsonite of Turkestan, whose copper mine lay beside a deposit of tin. It is a simple image, a miner, a workshop, an experiment, a spark of insight.
Yet it symbolizes what the Adamsonites represent throughout the narrative: a people positioned at crossroads, a people whose gifts expressed themselves in practical advances as well as spiritual ideals. Over time, the Adamsonite identity becomes less about a single isolated tribe and more about a spreading legacy.
Some lines moved north and west into Europe, mingling with later Andite waves. Others became part of the great movements that the book connects with early Indo-European expansions. Their distinctive culture diluted, but their contributions persisted, sometimes openly, sometimes as latent tendencies that later awakened in new civilizations. And behind it all, like a quiet choir in the unseen, remained the secondary midwayers. The book's implication is that the Adamsonite experiment was not only about visible history, it was about planetary continuity, about keeping alive, through confusion and collapse, some remnant of higher truth and higher order, so that later ages would not be forced to begin from nothing. So the Adamsonites stand in the Urantia Book as a unique bridge, a bridge between Adam and Eve's interrupted mission and the long human climb that followed, a bridge between the prince's early administration and the later world religions and civilizations, a bridge between the visible struggle of tribes and the invisible labor of helpers who work in the background of planetary affairs. They are not presented as perfect. They mix, they decline, they fragment, they migrate. But their story carries a persistent theme. Even on a world where the plan was delayed, something of the plan kept moving. Not always in the spotlight, often in the highlands, in hidden centers, in small selected groups, in family lines, in language, in tools, in myths, and in the quiet influence of advanced ideals that outlive the people who first carried them. For nearly 30,000 years, the Second Eden lay at the heart of Mesopotamia, a living cradle of civilization. From this fertile triangle between the rivers, the children of Adam carried their light into the world. Blended with the Nadite and Sangic tribes, they became known as the Andites, men and women who would ignite the first fires of recorded history and accelerate the cultural evolution of Urantia in ways no age had ever seen. This is the story of the violet race after the Adamic default, from 35,000 BC to their merging into the Andite peoples, and finally to their fading from Mesopotamia around 2000 BC.
When Adam and Eve arrived, the minds and morals of the races were low, yet physical evolution had continued untouched by rebellion. And even though their mission faltered, Adam's legacy still transformed Urantia. Biologically, socially, morally, and intellectually, the presence of the Adamic offspring quickened civilization everywhere. But 35,000 years ago, the world was still mostly savage. A few bright centers glowed across the continents, but most of the planet slept in primitive darkness.
This was the world before the violet race began its great expansion. The violet race, Adamites and Adamsonites. Their chief center, the second garden, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates. A northern outpost also flourished near the Caspian Sea and the Kopet Mountains. From these two centers, the life plasm and culture of Eden spread outward like ripples. Pre-Sumerians and Nodites. South, in Mesopotamia, remnants of Dalamatia's ancient culture endured. Blended over millennia with northern Adamites, they preserved the old Nodite traditions.
The Yellow Race. In Eastern Asia, the Chinese peoples thrived, building stable culture along the highlands near Tibet. The Blue Race. Europe's explorers and adventurers.
Their centers lay in the Mediterranean valleys and forests of the Northwest. Vital, restless, capable, yet slowed by Neanderthal absorption. Pre-Dravidian India, a mosaic of nearly every race on Earth, holding a culture just above the level of their neighbors. 8. The Sahara Civilization. Where desert now spreads, the indigo race once built progressive settlements, carrying traces of the older orange and green peoples. 9. The Mediterranean Basin. Here the world's great blend occurred. Blue men from the north, Saharans from the south, meeting Nodites and Adamites from the east. And at the center of all future promise lay Mesopotamia, the second garden, the one place where Eden's ideals might still rise again. The celestial watchers waited, wondering what the children of Adam and Eve would become. For thousands of years, Adam's sons and daughters labored along the great rivers, controlling floods in the south, fortifying their borders in the north, and keeping alive the memories of the first Eden. It was one of Urantia's great epics, a heroic people guarding a mission they never completely understood, yet always sending forth their best, their finest sons and daughters as ambassadors to uplift the surrounding tribes. Though it often weakened their homeland, the violet race always recovered, always rebuilt. Culturally, they stood far above the evolutionary races, matched only by the settlements of Van and Amadon and the high civilization of the Adamsonites. But their culture had been constructed, not evolved, a fragile inheritance dependent on memory, leadership, and purpose. As the millennia passed and the traditions of Eden faded, their civilization slowly declined toward a natural evolutionary level. Adam had left them rich in spirit and intellect, but limited in technology and resources, and after his death, the Edenic glow dimmed. Yet around 19,000 BC, the Adamites were still a great nation, over 4.5 million strong, and millions more of their blood had already flowed into the surrounding peoples.
They were not drafted, they volunteered. On Jerusalem, the system capital, Prince Caligastia stood before a multitude of willing candidates and chose only 100, ascendant mortals, each from a different inhabited world, 50 male and 50 female, drawn from hundreds of thousands. Their thought adjusters were detached for the strange requirements of this mission, but their souls were seasoned, their minds trained through the progressive worlds, ready for a frontier assignment no one could truly picture until it began. Caligastia himself was no novice, a Lananondek son with long system experience and an ambition sharpened by time. At last he received what he had asked for, a planetary princehood on Urantia, nearly 500,000 years before our day, arriving when human will was first dawning beside the emergence of the races. With him came Caligastia, his deputy, and the 100 who would become his corporeal staff. Urantia did not see them arrive.
The 100 came held in seraphic custody, suspended in unconscious stillness while preparations were made for something unprecedented on this world, their re-embodiment in material form. For this, native human stock was selected, 100 Adamsonite donors, 50 male and 50 female, whose life plasm would be transferred under meticulous supervision into bodies prepared for the staff. 10 days. That was the span from arrival to full waking, from held to walking. And when they rose, newly repersonalized, they stood as human-like beings, Adamsonite in characteristics and language, yet superhuman in origin and capacity. The nearby tribes who had never seen such ideal humans carried the shock into legend, but the staff did not amplify the myth. They refused spectacle.
They worked as much as possible by natural means, teaching, modeling, persuading, so that progress would be real and not merely fear.
They lived as flesh. They ate, drank, slept, and labored as material beings. Yet their physical continuity depended on higher life provisions that Urantia did not possess. A city rose near the head of the Persian Gulf, Dalmatia. Not a metropolis by modern measures, but a planned garden city in a savage world. Walled, ordered, experimental. Council mansions arranged around a sensual spiritual focal point, an architecture of purpose rather than vanity. Inside the walls, workshops, instruction circles, cultivated plots. Outside, tribal encampments, visitors drawn to a place rumored to be different, safe, bright, governed. In the heart of it all was a quiet center, worship taught without idols, learning offered without conquest. The staff lived like teachers among students. They avoided miracles. They feared deification more than hardship. Their power was never meant to be theater. It was meant to be leaven. They divided themselves into 10 councils, 10 members each, domains of culture, each with a leader whose name became known among mortals. When issues overlapped, councils met under Caligastia's coordinating chairmanship. And then the slow revolution began. So slow it barely looked like revolution at all. They taught food security and welfare, wells, springs, irrigation, preservation, and the patient logic of seasons. They shaped domestication. Cattle improved for milk and meat, oxen trained for pulling, long experiments that nudged survival toward stability. They dealt with predators and safety, secure dwellings, stockades, early walls, how fear of the night begins to loosen its grip. They guarded knowledge, organized instruction and the first steps toward writing, so memory could outlive a single voice. The city became a living classroom, a visible proof that order could exist without tyranny, that advancement could arrive without slaughter. Centuries passed, then millennia. The world remained hard, but around Dalmatia, the human story bent upward. At dusk, torches climbed the walls. Dalmatia looked secure. The gardens still breathed, the workshops still glowed, but the air began to carry a tension no one could fully name, like a pressure change before a storm. Within the city, Caligastia withdrew into himself. The slow pace of evolution irritated him. The limitations of the human mind felt like chains. The long discipline of uplift began to feel inside him like an insult. And somewhere beyond Urantia, a greater rebellion gathered its words into a manifesto. One midwinter day, ordinary at first, Caligastia summoned all 10 councils to an extraordinary assembly. He stood before the 100 and proclaimed a new reality, that he was absolute sovereign of Urantia, and that allegiance must transfer to him and to the new liberty he offered. Caligastia demanded the governing powers be handed over immediately. The room froze. Then Van rose, not in drama, in refusal. Van denounced it as rebellion and urged restraint, an appeal upward, a pause, a chance for truth to answer. The staff hesitated. They agreed to wait for guidance from Lucifer, the system sovereign, still unaware that Lucifer was the source of the poison. And when the reply came, it did not correct Caligastia. It confirmed him. Lucifer demanded obedience to the self-proclaimed god of Urantia. The thin veil tore. The universe line was drawn. Van answered with a legendary 7-hour indictment, charging Caligastia, Caligastia, and Lucifer with betrayal, declaring loyalty to the universe sovereign and appealing to the Most Highs for lawful intervention. Then came the immediate consequence. Urantia's communication circuits were severed. Planetary quarantine. No council in or out.
Every being on Urantia, angel, midwayer, and staff alike, was forced to decide in isolation. Caligastia formally declared Caligastia god of Urantia and demanded the choice: follow rebellion or stand loyal to the unseen sovereign. There was no mortal battlefield. There was a battle of mind and spirit, 7 bitter years of persuasion, fear, logic, seduction, and courage. The staff fractured. Angels and midwayers fractured. Even the human pupils around Dalmatia split, some intoxicated by the promise of godlike autonomy, others sickened by the lie. And beside Van stood an Adamsonite man, Amadon. Not brilliant by celestial standards, not armored by advanced education, yet unshakable, standing with Van through the entire long crisis, becoming the human emblem of loyalty when higher minds fell.
At last, the issues clarified, decisions hardened into destiny. Only then did external intervention arrive, emergency Melchizedek receivers, provisional authority to replace the defaulted prince, but the damage had already entered the bones of the world. When receivership was established, the loyal staff, all except Van, were returned to Jerusalem, reunited with their waiting adjusters, free to resume the interrupted ascent. Van chose to remain. He petitioned to stay on Urantia until the coming of Adam and Eve, and the request was granted. Most of the loyal human attendants were translated as well, but Amadon stayed, by choice, alongside Van. By a mercy measure linked to the Tree of Life, now removed from the doomed region and transplanted to Van's highland refuge, Van and Amadon were sustained for more than 150,000 years, living as a continuity line through the long, dark aftermath. In exile, Van reorganized what remained, 10 committees mirroring the old council structure, a reduced but determined scaffolding of order meant to keep truth alive in a world suddenly without its intended governance. The rebels could not keep what they stole. Cut off from higher life supports, they faced mortality. They began to build a legacy the only way stranded supermen can, by mixing into humanity and producing the strains that would become known as nodites, carrying fragments of Dalmatian knowledge into the tribes while also seeding myths of gods mating with mortals. Dalmatia itself did not endure. A little more than a century and a half after the rebellion, seismic upheavals and the sea engulfed the region. The first world capital sank beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. The city had already degenerated, its spiritual center profaned into a shrine of a false god. And then it was gone, never to reemerge. The rebels and their families became wanderers, settling north and east, leaving behind the land of Nod in later memory, an echo of exile turned into geography, lineage turned into legend. If you ask what survived, the answer is not a city. What survived was a thread, ideas planted too early for the world to hold, that knowledge should be preserved, that cooperation should replace endless vendetta, that hygiene matters, that trade can be peaceful, that worship can aim upward instead of outward, and above all, a thread of loyalty, held by Van and by Amadon when the world went quiet and heaven's circuits went dark. The first planetary staff came to uplift a primitive world. Their story became, instead, Urantia's first great test of allegiance, proof that civilization can be taught and that truth can be carried, even when leadership collapses. The torch did not go out, it simply moved into the mountains and waited.
According to the Urantia Book, the incarnation of Jesus was the seventh and final bestowal of Michael of Nebadon, a creator son who had already lived 6 lives as different orders of his creation to achieve experiential sovereignty over his universe. For this last bestowal, Michael chose to be born as a helpless human infant on Urantia, Earth, a world described as the disordered and disturbed planet of your choice. This decision was made after careful deliberation. Michael selected Urantia following a special Melchizedek report on isolated, spiritually wayward worlds, and he convened the usual pre-incarnation council with his elder brother Emmanuel, the Paradise Advisor. Michael willingly relinquished his direct divine powers and authority for the duration of the earthly life, entrusting the administration of his universe to Emmanuel, and agreeing to live solely under the Father's will while on earth. In other words, no superhuman intervention or extraplanetary support would aid this incarnation. He would experience life as a mortal man from birth onward. With the time and planet of this momentous incarnation chosen, Gabriel, the chief executive of Michael's universe, was dispatched to Earth to make the necessary preparations for the divine son's arrival. Gabriel's first task was to select a suitable people and family into which Jesus, Michael, would be born. After surveying the world's races, Gabriel decided that the Hebrew people offered the best cultural and spiritual environment for this mission. Upon Michael's approval of this choice, Gabriel impaneled a family commission of 12, a group of higher celestial personalities, to secretly investigate the Jewish families of Palestine in search of the ideal parentage for the incarnation. This commission, after thorough study, submitted 3 possible couples who they deemed equally qualified to serve as Jesus' human parents. Gabriel himself then reviewed these candidates and made the personal choice of a young couple from Nazareth, Joseph and Mary. Having chosen them, Gabriel proceeded to appear on earth to each of them in turn to announce the honor and responsibility that would be theirs. According to the Urantia Book account, these celestial selections and plans were made well before any traditional biblical events began, setting the stage for an unprecedented incarnation of a creator son on our world.
Paper 121, The Times of Michael's Bestowal, provides a rich backdrop of the world, and specifically Palestine, around the time Jesus was born, approximately 7 to 6 BC. Far from depicting an age of utter decadence or chaos, the Urantia Book paints the 1st century BC as a uniquely favorable era for the introduction of new spiritual truth. Paper 122 of the Urantia Book details why Joseph and Mary were chosen and provides unique insight into their family backgrounds. Of all couples in Palestine around that time, Joseph and Mary offered the most ideal combination of widespread racial connections and superior average of personality endowments. Michael's plan was to live a truly average human life so that the common people might understand him. Accordingly, Gabriel selected just such persons as Joseph and Mary to be Jesus' earthly parents. In other words, this humble Nazareth couple was uniquely suitable to rear a child who would be both truly human and destined for a divine mission.
Joseph, the foster father of Jesus, whom the Urantia Book often calls Joshua ben Joseph, was described as a Hebrew of the Hebrews, though his lineage included many non-Jewish ancestors through maternal lines. His family line traced back to the time of Abraham and beyond, including ancestry from the Sumerians and even the ancient Nodite and Andinite peoples, reflecting a broad racial heritage. Joseph's forefathers were mostly craftsmen, builders, carpenters, masons, and smiths, and Joseph himself was a working carpenter by trade, later becoming a building contractor. Notably, the Urantia Book points out that Joseph was not actually of the royal line of David, a fact which later Gospel writers tried to adjust. 6 generations before, one of Joseph's ancestors had been adopted into a Davidic family, which legally accounted for Joseph being of the house of David, but by actual bloodline he was not a direct son of King David. Joseph is portrayed as a quiet, thoughtful, and devout man. He was conscientious and kind-hearted, saddened by the difficult plight of his people. Though generally even-tempered, in the early years of marriage, he occasionally experienced mild spiritual discouragement due to the heavy responsibilities he bore. Nonetheless, Joseph was a loving father and a man of faith who trained his children diligently in the Jewish religious traditions. Mary, the mother of Jesus, also had an illustrious and mixed ancestry. She was a descendant of a long line of unique ancestors, embracing many of the most remarkable women in the racial history of Urantia. The Urantia Book even names some of these notable women: Anan, Tamar, Ruth, Bathsheba, Ansi, Chloe, Eve, Enta, and Rhoda, indicating that no other Jewish woman of that day had a more illustrious lineage or one reaching back to more auspicious beginnings. Culturally and religiously, Mary was a Jewess, but racially her family heritage was very diverse. Her bloodline included Syrian, Hittite, Phoenician, Greek, and Egyptian strains in addition to Hebrew. In fact, the Urantia Book notes it is hardly proper to regard Mary as a Jewess in pure ethnicity, so broad was her genetic background. In personality, Mary is described as almost the opposite of Joseph. She was cheerful, expressive, and warm-hearted, possessing an ever-sunny disposition. She was emotionally open and rarely melancholic. Throughout Jesus' remarkable life, Mary remained courageous and devoted, though she sometimes wavered in understanding his mission. She had an intuitive faith in her child's destiny, strengthened by the memory of Gabriel's visit to her. Mary was skilled in household arts and was an expert weaver, and both she and Joseph were considered well-educated by the standards of their day.
It is worth noting how the Urantia Book reinterprets certain biblical notions about Jesus' parentage. The authors emphasize that many of the messianic prophecies and traditional beliefs were later attributed to Jesus without being literally true. For instance, centuries of Hebrew prophets had predicted a deliverer from the line of David. Early followers of Jesus, eager to fit him into these expectations, constructed genealogies linking both Joseph and Mary to King David and even back to Adam. The Urantia Book flatly states that many of these lineages on the whole are not genuine and may not be depended upon as factual. Likewise, the famous prophecy from Isaiah that a maiden shall bear a son was eventually misinterpreted as a virgin shall bear a son, contributing to the legend of the virgin birth. The Urantia account makes it clear that aside from the angelic announcement of Jesus' conception, no supernatural mechanism was involved in Mary's pregnancy. Joseph and Mary were a normal married couple who anticipated the birth of their child in the natural course. The true marvel, in Urantia perspective, was not a biological miracle, but the incarnation itself, the fact that the creator of a universe would consent to be born as a mortal baby. The Urantia Book's account of Jesus' birth, Part 4, Paper 122, carefully chronicles the unique sequence of events leading up to that sacred day. These events incorporate some familiar elements from the New Testament narrative, such as angelic announcements and John the Baptist's birth, but with distinctive details and timing.
March 8 BC. Joseph and Mary marry in Nazareth. Joseph, aged 21, and the teenage Mary were married according to Jewish custom at Mary's family home near Nazareth. The young couple settled in Nazareth, where Joseph, a carpenter, had built a modest one-room stone house for them with an adjoining workshop. They anticipated starting their family there. Little did they know that their first child would be born away from home in Judea. June 8 BC. Gabriel appears to Elizabeth. 3 months after the wedding, the angel Gabriel made a sudden visit, not to Mary initially, but to Elizabeth, the wife of Zacharias. Zacharias was a priest of the Jews, and Elizabeth happened to be Mary's much older cousin.
At noontide one day in late June, while Zacharias was serving in the Jerusalem temple and praying for the coming of a deliverer, Gabriel manifested himself to Elizabeth at her home. Gabriel announced that Elizabeth would finally have a son, despite her old age and previously childless marriage, and that you shall call your son John. This child, Gabriel said, would be the forerunner of this divine teacher, a herald to prepare the people for the coming of the Lord's chosen one. Gabriel also revealed to Elizabeth that her young kinswoman Mary would be the mother of the promised child of destiny, and he promised, "I will also appear to her." This angelic message greatly stunned Elizabeth. She kept Gabriel's visit secret for 5 months, telling no one, not even Zacharias at first, about the promise that her son would herald the Messiah. When Elizabeth finally shared the news with Zacharias, he was skeptical and struggled to believe her story, until he himself experienced a vivid dream, confirming that Elizabeth's child was indeed to be a prophet preparing the way for the Lord. Sure enough, Elizabeth soon found herself expectant, just as Gabriel had said.
November 8 BC. Gabriel's announcement to Mary. True to his word, Gabriel paid a visit to Mary about 5 months later. Paper 122, Section 3, vividly describes that one evening, about sundown, before Joseph had returned home, the brilliant angel appeared to Mary beside a low stone table in her Nazareth house. Gabriel greeted the startled young woman and delivered a momentous message. "I come at the bidding of one who is my master. I announce that the conception within you is ordained by heaven, and that in due time you will become the mother of a son. You shall call him Joshua, Jesus, and he shall inaugurate the kingdom of heaven on earth and among men." Gabriel told Mary that this child was the child of destiny long awaited, and reassured her, "My benediction rests upon you. The power of the Most Highs will strengthen you, and the Lord of all the earth shall overshadow you." He also informed Mary that her relative Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant with a son, John, who will prepare the way for Mary's own son. Mary was stunned by this angelic proclamation, but received it with deep humility and faith. According to the Urantia Book, this visit from Gabriel occurred the day after Jesus was conceived, and it was the only event of supernatural occurrence in all of Mary's experience of carrying and birthing the child. In other words, no other miraculous signs accompanied the pregnancy, only this vital announcement to prepare Mary for her role.
Early February, 7 BC, Mary visits Elizabeth. In the weeks after Gabriel's message, Mary pondered this visitation secretly in her heart, waiting until she was certain she was with child before telling Joseph about it. As expected, Joseph found Mary's news difficult to accept at first. Meanwhile, Gabriel had mentioned to each woman about the other's angelic encounter, so naturally Mary grew eager to visit Elizabeth and share their experiences. Mary persuaded her husband to let her travel south to Judea. In early February of 7 BC, Mary journeyed to the city of Judah in the hills, traditionally Hebron, where Zacharias and Elizabeth lived. Mary stayed with her older cousin for 3 weeks, and during this visit, the two women confided in each other, compared their miraculous stories, and rejoiced together. Elizabeth's faith and understanding greatly strengthened Mary's faith in the vision of Gabriel, reassuring the young mother-to-be that her experience was real and part of God's plan. By the time Mary returned to Nazareth, she was fully dedicated to her calling to mother the child of promise as a helpless babe, an average and normal infant of the realm.
March 25, 7 BC. John the Baptist is born. As Gabriel had foretold, Elizabeth gave birth to a son in late March of 7 BC. The Urantia Book specifies March 25, 7 BC for John's birth. The neighbors and relatives rejoiced with Elizabeth, and on the 8th day the child was circumcised and formally named John as the angel directed. Zacharias, by now convinced through a dream of his own, insisted on the name John despite local custom. Word of baby John's arrival was sent by messenger to Mary in Nazareth, announcing that a son had been born to Elizabeth and his name was to be John. From his infancy, John was raised with the knowledge that his life had a special purpose. Zacharias and Elizabeth carefully instilled in him the idea that he was to grow up to become a spiritual leader and religious teacher, preparing the way for the Lord. The boy was nurtured in an atmosphere of great expectation, often visiting the temple with his priest father and absorbing the faith of his people from an early age.
The air outside the fortress of Antonia still held the chill of night. A knot of temple guards and Roman soldiers marched into the forecourt, and between them walked Jesus, wrists bound, robe dusty from the Olive Garden soil, his face strangely calm after a sleepless night. Behind the soldiers pressed a cluster of about 50 accusers, members of the Sanhedrin, mostly Sadducees, Caiaphas in his robes of authority, scribes and elders hurrying to keep their dignity in the half-light. Judas lurked somewhere in that nervous crowd, and John Zebedee kept as close as he dared, torn between fear and loyalty. The Praetorian loomed above them, stone steps leading up to the main entrance. But the Jewish leaders stopped at the line where Gentile flooring began. They would not step inside. On this day of preparation, they would murder a righteous man, yet they would not risk ceremony defilement by entering a Roman hall where unleavened bread might have been baked. They clustered at the foot of the steps, shouting for Pilate. Inside, Pontius Pilate was already awake. He had been warned the previous evening. The priesthood wanted Roman soldiers for a secret arrest in Gethsemane. That meant trouble. So he was dressed, briefed, and waiting when the early morning delegation arrived. Pilate was not an incompetent governor. Tiberius would have never tolerated open stupidity in a province as tense as Judea. He could organize, administer, and on good days, rule with some measure of fairness. But Pilate was morally small. He never truly understood the people he governed. To him, the Jews were an irritating religious tribe, touchy, intense, dangerous in groups. He did not grasp that these Hebrews carried a living faith that they were prepared to die for, or that millions scattered throughout the empire looked to Jerusalem as the heart of their worship, and to the Sanhedrin as their supreme court. Worse, a series of early blunders had put him in chains to their threats. At first, he ignored their hatred of images. He let his soldiers march into Jerusalem with the imperial emblems of Caesar still fastened to their standards. When a delegation of Jews begged him for days to remove them, he threatened them with mass execution, confident that they would bow to the fear. He was stunned when they lay down in the dust and bared their necks, preferring death to idolatry. Pilate's courage collapsed before their willingness to die. He backed down, ordered the images removed, and from that day on, the leaders of the Jews knew his weakness. He made threats he dared not carry out. Trying to recover his prestige, he placed shields inscribed to the emperor on the walls of Herod's palace. When the Jews protested and he refused to listen, they appealed to Rome, and Rome ordered the shields removed. His authority sank even lower. Later, he raided the temple treasury to build an aqueduct for the city. Practical in his own mind, he was blind to the sacredness of those funds in Jewish eyes. Riots flared. Blood flowed in the precincts of worship. His administration strained with the resentment. Time and time again, to avoid complaints reaching Tiberius, Pilate yielded ground. The priests learned the formula. If he resisted, they threatened unrest. If they threatened unrest, he was almost always give in. Now, as the first light washed the Praetorian walls, all those old failures sat on his shoulders like invisible chains. Pilate stepped out onto the broad stone platform, flanked by Roman guards, and sat on the judgment seat that he had set up outside. Below, the crowd shifted, torches guttered, and Jesus stood between two soldiers, silently watching. Pilate raised his voice over a murmur. "What charge do you bring against this man?" The leading counselor had not planned to argue details. They wanted to rubber stamp confirmation of a sentence already arranged in their own court. So the spokesman answered with a thinly veiled irritation. "If he were not a wrongdoer, we would not have brought him to you." It was an answer that carried entitlement, not respect. Pilate's eyes narrowed. He knew they'd been up all night, supposedly establishing this man's guilt. Now they stood before him, unwilling to even name the accusation. "If you have no clear charge," he said coolly, "take him yourselves. Judge him by your own law." The clerk of the Sanhedrin stepped forward, voice edged with fury. "We are not allowed to put this man to death. This one deserves to die for what he has taught and done. That is why we brought him to you." There it was. Not just a trial, but a demand for Roman crucifixion. Pilate paused, stung by their presumption. They were treating their governor as a stamped seal, their court as a real authority, Rome as a tool. He waited. When they still hesitated, he refused to proceed. "I will not condemn this man without a trial," he said. "I will not even question him until you put charges in writing." Reluctantly, they signaled. The clerk stepped forward with a document. Pilate unrolled it and read, "He disturbs the peace and misleads the nation. He forbids the paying of tribute to Caesar. He calls himself the King of the Jews and speaks of a new kingdom." Jesus had not been properly tried or legally convicted of any of this, and he had not even heard these charges in Jewish court. Now Pilate had him brought closer and commanded that the accusations be repeated in his hearing. As the words echoed over the stones, Jesus stood utterly quiet. John Zebedee knew these charges were distorted. The priest knew. Jesus knew. Still he answered nothing. When Pilate urged him to reply, Jesus remained silent, calm, dignified, unmoved by the spite in these voices around him. Something about the silence unsettled the governor, the unfairness of it all, the majesty of the prisoner's bearing, the contrast between hatred and composure. Pilate decided he must question this man alone. Jesus and John were taken into a side chamber of the praetorium. The guards remained outside. Pilate motioned for Jesus to sit, and then sat beside him, an unusual gesture for a Roman judge facing an accused provincial. He almost began with an apology. He said he did not believe the first charge, that Jesus incited rebellion or tried to twist the nation into revolt. Then he focused on the second, a political issue Rome cared about. "Did you ever teach the people that they should refuse to pay taxes to Caesar?" Jesus did not argue for himself. He turned slightly and pointed to John. "Ask him," he said simply, "or any man who's heard my teaching." Pilate questioned John, the younger apostle. Steady but still shaken by the night's events, explained plainly that the master had taught loyalty in civil matters and that they themselves paid taxes to both Caesar and to the temple. When he had heard enough, Pilate fixed John with a serious look. "Say nothing of this conversation," he warned, "to anyone." John stored those words in silence. He kept them for years. Then Pilate turned back to Jesus. Another question burned in his mind. One that came not just from the written charges, but from whispers he had already heard in Jerusalem. "Now about this third accusation," he said. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Something in his tone, half sincere, half curious, made Jesus smile gently. "Do you ask this for yourself?" he replied. "Or do you ask because of what others have said about me?" The Roman bristled. "Am I a Jew?" he shot back. "Your own people and their chief priest brought you to me and demanded your death. I'm trying to find out what you've done. Tell me, have you claimed to be the King of the Jews? Have you tried to start a kingdom?" Jesus answered, and in answering lifted the conversation far above Roman politics. He explained that his kingdom was not of this world. If it were, his followers would be fighting to save him from arrest. His very presence here, bound and unresisting, proved that his sovereignty was a spiritual, a brotherhood of men and women who, through faith and love, had become sons and daughters of God. This salvation, he said, was for Jew and Gentile alike. Pilate caught enough of the idea to ask the obvious question, "Then you are a king?" Jesus did not flinch. Yes, he said, he was a king, but his kingship was of those who love the truth, of the family of faith, whose Father was in heaven. For this he had been born, to reveal the Father and bear witness to the truth of God. Everyone who genuinely loved truth, he said, listened to his voice. Pilate listened, but his soul was shallow ground for such words. Half tired, half mocking, he murmured the infamous question, "Truth? What is truth?" He had studied Stoic philosophers who called the wise man king. He could grasp that metaphor, but he could not rise to the spiritual reality standing beside him. Still, he knew one thing very clearly now. This man was no political rebel, no armed Messiah dreaming of the throne of Israel. Face to face, Jesus looked like a gentle, weary, but upright spiritual teacher, not a seditionist. To Pilate, he seemed almost like a harmless visionary, a fanatic, perhaps, but an innocent one. Pilate went back out and told the priests honestly. He found no fault in this man. The charges did not hold. The priests answered with renewed fury, insisting that Jesus stirred up people all over Judea, starting from Galilee. At the word Galilee, Pilate saw an escape. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, was in the city for the Passover. Let Herod handle this thorny religious figure from his own jurisdiction. He ordered Jesus sent to Herod. Herod received him in the old Hasmonean palace. The tetrarch had heard many rumors about Jesus' miracles and teaching. He was not thinking of the earnest teenager who once had come to Sepphoris, seeking justice for a family debt. That episode had long faded. He saw only an opportunity for spiritual entertainment. He questioned Jesus at length, taunting, coaxing, demanding a sign, a wonder, a spectacle. Jesus stood silent. Herod turned towards the chief priests and the Sadducees, heard their accusations, and grew bored when the prisoner refused to perform for him. At last, in crude mockery of Jesus' claim to the kingdom, he had an old purple robe thrown over his shoulders, made sport of him with his court, and sent him back to Pilate. Herod knew he had no authority over this case in Judea. Deep inside, he was relieved. The man who had stirred Galilee was now someone else's responsibility. The shadow of John the Baptist still haunted his conscience. He had at times feared that Jesus might be John raised from the dead. Seeing now how different this quiet man was from the fiery prophet from the Jordan, his fears were eased, and Pilate's burden was doubled. When Jesus returned, Pilate again came out to the judgment seat of the assembled both rulers and people. He repeated his verdict. Neither he nor Herod had found anything worthy of death. If the priests insisted, he was willing to chastise Jesus and release him, but he could not honestly condemn him to die. At that very moment, a large multitude began streaming up towards the praetorium. It was the yearly custom for the Roman governor to release one prisoner for the Passover as a gesture of goodwill. The crowd came expecting this favor. Pilate saw yet another possible escape. Offer them Jesus. But the name that rose from the mob's mouth was not the master's. They shouted for Barabbas, a notorious agitator and robber, a convicted murderer awaiting execution after the feast. Pilate stood and shouted over the noise, explaining that Jesus had been brought by the chief priests on serious charges, yet he found the man innocent. Then he shouted the choice. "Whom do you want me to release? Barabbas the murderer, or Jesus of Galilee?" The priests moved swiftly through the crowd, whispering, urging, steering the mood. When they cried out for Barabbas, the crowd shifted with them. The awe they had once felt for Jesus, the man who had cleansed the temple and healed the sick, dissolved now that he had stood bound and apparently defeated. The cry rose and hardened, "Barabbas! Barabbas!" Pilate felt his temper flare. How could they demand a criminal's freedom in the blood of a man whose worst crime was a spiritual claim? He made the mistake of saying it out loud, referring again to Jesus as the King of the Jews. To the Jewish leaders, whose hope was for conquering Messiah burned hot, and whose pride chafed under the Roman occupation, the phrase sounded like an insult, a mockery of their national dream. The response was immediate and fierce, a roar for Barabbas's release and for Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate hesitated. He knew Jesus was innocent. A just and courageous judge would have dismissed the case and freed him, but Pilate was neither just enough nor brave enough. Behind the crowd roar, he heard only one thing: danger for himself. Then a messenger pushed through with a sealed note from his wife Claudia. Pilate paused to read it. She begged him to have nothing to do with the condemnation of this righteous man. He had suffered in a troubling dream about Jesus and was convinced of his innocence. The note shook him badly and stalled the proceedings, giving the priest more time to work the masses. They moved through the crowd like poison, securing louder calls for Barabbas and louder demands that Jesus be crucified. When Pilate asked what should be done with the one called the King of the Jews, the answer came back in a chilling unison: "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate made one last attempt, an appeal to pity. He ordered Jesus taken into the courtyard and scourged. By Roman law, such flogging belonged to those already sentenced to crucifixion. Here it was, used illegally as a political maneuver. The soldiers bound Jesus to a post. Before the first lashes fell, they threw the faded purple robe over him again, twisting the wreath of thorns, jamming it into his brow, placing a reed on his head as a mock scepter, and knelt in cruel mimicry. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him, struck his face, and finally took the reed and beat down the thorns into his flesh. When Pilate saw enough blood and brutality to satisfy any normal hatred, he ordered them to stop and brought Jesus back out to the platform. There he stood, robe hanging in torn folds, crown of thorns piercing his brow, blood on his face, shoulders sagging with pain and exhaustion, yet something in his eyes remained gentle and clear. Pilate gestured toward him. "Behold the man," he said. "I still find no crime in him. Having scourged him, I would release him." For a heartbeat, the sight shocked even the hardened accusers. But hatred has a way of hardening faster than pity can melt it. The brief quiet broke into an even fiercer cry. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate's voice sharpened. "Why? What evil has he done? Who will state his crime?" The answer was not a crime, but a theological verdict. The high priest himself came forward, eyes blazing. "We have a law," he shouted, "and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Pilate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His wife's dream, his own uneasy conscience, and now this claim. The old pagan tales of gods walking among men flickered in the edge of his mind. For the second time, he took Jesus back inside. In the quieter light of the inner chamber, Pilate sat, trembling, and looked at this prisoner. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "Who are you, really? Is it true? You are the Son of God?" Jesus did not answer. Pilate had declared himself innocent, yet had allowed him to be scourged. He was a judge who feared men more than justice. Jesus would not dignify that weakness with further explanations. Silence lay heavy between them. Stung, Pilate blurted, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" Jesus lifted his eyes and met Pilate's gaze with calm authority. He told him what every earthly ruler forgets. No man has real power over the Son of Man except what the Father in heaven allows. Pilate's authority was borrowed, limited, permitted from above. His guilt, while real, was less than those who betrayed and delivered Jesus, knowing far better what they were doing. Those words shook Pilate to the core. Fear of the Jews now mingled with the fear of the invisible. He walked back out, desperate to end the nightmare, ready once more to deliver Jesus back to the priests as a purely religious offender. But Caiaphas and the rulers had saved their most effective weapon for last. When Pilate showed any sign of releasing Jesus, the high priest stepped forward, where all could hear, and hurled the decisive threat. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king speaks against Caesar." In that sentence, Pilate heard the future. A report to Rome that had sided with a man accused of royal pretensions. Already under suspicion for earlier misrules and riots, he could not risk another black mark before the emperor. Fear for his own position crushed the last remaining impulse towards justice. He brought Jesus out again and pointed to him with bitter irony. "Behold your king!" The answer crashed back. "Away with him! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked, half in sarcasm, half in despair. The chief priest replied with words that stunned even the crowd. "We have no king but Caesar." So they nailed the national soul to Roman power rather than acknowledge the Son of God standing before them. Here stood the incarnate Son of God, the Son of Man. He had been arrested without clear indictment, accused without evidence, examined without credible witnesses, scourged without a legal sentence, and now was about to condemn to die by the judge who openly admitted he found no fault in him. Pilate looked at the roaring mob, at the priest vibrating with triumph, at the man in the purple robe and thorny crown, and collapsed inside. He ordered the release of Barabbas. Then, in a symbolic attempt to wash his conscience clean, he called for the water. He dipped his hands before the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You are determined that he shall die. I find no guilt in him. See to it yourselves." The crowd roared back its terrible answer. "His blood be upon us and upon our children." The unjust bargain was sealed. Later, Pilate would recall to Rome, after another brutal massacre, removed from office, to live out his years under the shadow of this day, a man haunted by the death of the innocent one that he lacked courage to save. His wife, Claudia, would be drawn ever more deeply into the faith of the very man her husband had condemned. Rome made a grave mistake when they sent a second-rate governor to face the greatest moral crisis in Judea's history. But even in that failure, another kingdom went quietly forward. A kingdom not of this world, founded not by the decrees of Pilate or the cries of the crowds, but in the hearts of all who still hear that calm voice and, loving the truth, choose to follow it. Night pressed down on Gethsemane like a held breath. Jesus sat alone near the old olive press, calm in the silver wash of moonlight, while his friends dozed, scattered among the trees. Then, along the ridge, a string of torches appeared, moving, weaving, carrying steel and hostility toward the quiet garden. Judas walked out in front of them. He had chosen this place carefully, just far enough ahead from the soldiers he could pretend that he had arrived first, as if he had run ahead to warn the master. In his mind, he had rehearsed the scene. He would point out Jesus, perhaps give a kiss, and then slip away quickly, leaving the guards to do their work while he stood off to one side as a concerned observer. Betrayal, but from at a safe distance. It did not unfold that way. As the torches swung into view, Peter, James, John, and about 30 campers instantly understood what was happening. They surged towards the olive press where Jesus sat, hearts pounding, sleep gone. On one side, the soldiers and temple guards, armed and grim. On the other, the bewildered but loyal followers. In the space between them, Jesus stood alone and composed. Judas moved towards to deliver his sign, but before he could reach him, Jesus stepped aside and faced the foremost soldier, the Roman captain. "Whom do you seek?" he asked, voice steady. "Jesus of Nazareth," the captain replied. Jesus stood up, looking him in the eyes. "I am he." The simple words landed with strange power. Many of the armed men had heard him teach. Others had heard stories of his works. But now, seeing him stand there in such an unshaken majesty, so calm and unafraid, the front ranks suddenly fell back in confusion. Torches jolted, armor clattered, fear rippled through the line. For a moment, there was no need for any signal. The master had already given himself up. But Judas needed to justify his presence, and he still clung to the reward he believed was coming. Shaken but trapped in his own bargain, he stepped up to Jesus, laid a kiss upon his brow, and said, "Hail, Master and Teacher." Jesus answered with such kindness that cut deeper than any accusation. "Friend, it is not enough that you would do this, but you would even betray the Son of Man with a kiss." The apostles and disciples stood frozen, stunned. The soldiers had rallied from their first shock. The followers had pressed closer, unsure what to do. In the tension of that moment, one more indignity broke loose. A Syrian bodyguard of the high priest Malchus stepped forward to bind Jesus' hands behind his back, though the Roman captain had not even ordered it. When Peter saw this, something in him snapped. No longer able to contain himself, he drew his sword and rushed forward with the others to defend the master. Steel flashed. Before the soldiers could respond, Jesus raised his hand, firm, commanding, "Peter, put up your sword. They who take the sword shall perish by the sword. Do you not understand that this is the Father's will that I drink this cup? Do you not know that I could, even now, call more than 12 legions of angels, that they would deliver me from the hands of these few men?" The impulse of violence died in mid-stride. The moment of resistance collapsed. Still, the flare of struggle was enough to frighten the captain. Fearing an attempt at rescue, he quickly ordered Jesus seized and bound with heavy cords. As they tied his hands, Jesus said quietly to his captors, "Why do you come out against me with swords and staves as though I'm a robber? I was with you daily in the temple, teaching openly, and you did not lay hold to me." His followers heard the captain's orders to arrest them too, and fled into the darkness of the ravine. John Mark, who had been hiding in a nearby shed, tried to slip away and join the others, but one of the last soldiers caught his linen garment. The young man twisted free, leaving the coat in the soldier's hand, and escaped naked into the night. Breathless, he found David Zebedee, and together they roused the sleeping apostles, telling them the master had been arrested. Meanwhile, the bound Jesus was led away from the garden. A dispute broke out as they left. The captain of the temple guard insisted they go directly to Caiaphas, the acting high priest. The Roman captain ordered that Jesus be taken first to Annas, the elder former high priest, with whom the Romans were accustomed to deal with in ecclesiastical matters. The Roman word prevailed. They set out towards the palace of Annas. Judas walked near the captains, listening to every word, but neither officer spoke to him. They despised the betrayer too much, even to address him. John Zebedee, remembering Jesus' instructions to stay near, made his way up beside the prisoner as they marched between the two captains. The temple commander saw him and ordered that John be bound as well. But the Roman captain intervened. He called John over to his side and said, in effect, "No one is to touch this man." He had watched John in the garden, unarmed, uncowardly. He knew that he was no threat. Roman law, he reminded the others, allows a prisoner at least one friend to stand by him. This man shall be with his master. Judas heard this and burned with shame. He dropped back to the shadows, trailing the procession from a distance, and at last drifted away towards Caiaphas' house alone. The Roman officer went further. As they reached Annas' palace gates and handed Jesus over to the temple guards, he ordered his own assistant, "Go with the prisoner. See that they do not kill him without Pilate's consent. Watch that he is not assassinated. And see that his friend, the Galilean, is allowed to stand by and observe all that happens." From that moment, John moved under Roman protection, The Jews dared not touch him until after the crucifixion. This is why John was able to remain near Jesus throughout the terrible night and the following day. All the way to Annas' house, Jesus said nothing. At the palace of Annas, the former high priest seized his chance. Annas was wealthy from temple revenues, powerful in family connections, and deeply offended by Jesus' recent cleansing of the temple courts. He had long feared for his prestige and income. Tonight he meant to ensure that this Galilean would either leave Palestine or die. Jesus was kept there for about 3 hours. John was known to the older servants. He and his brother James had visited there before, since Annas was distantly related to their mother. And so John remained close by, listening, watching. In the great audience chamber, Annas sat in his high chair and had Jesus brought before him, hands bound behind his back. He studied him in silence. The master's calm, regal bearings unsettled even this seasoned plotter. "You realize something must be done about your teaching," Annas began, "for you are disturbing the peace and order of our nation." Jesus looked at him and said nothing. Annas pressed on, asking about his disciples, even naming Simon Zelotes as an agitator. No answer. He hinted at the power he held over Jesus' fate, trying to provoke fear or compromise. At last Jesus spoke. "Annas, you know you could have no power over me unless it were permitted by my Father. Some would destroy the Son of Man because they are ignorant. They know not what they do. But you, my friend, know what you are doing. How then can you reject the light of God?" The gentleness of his tone almost disarmed Annas. But the old priest had already made up his mind. He demanded to know what Jesus was really teaching, what he claimed to be. Jesus replied that he had always spoken openly in synagogues and in the temple, never in secret. If Annas wished to know his doctrine, he should call the people who had heard him. "All Jerusalem has heard what I have spoken, even if you yourself have not," he said. At that, the chief steward standing by struck Jesus in the face. "How dare you answer the high priest so?" Annas rebuked no one. Jesus, however, turned to the man who had hit him and said, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness to the evil. But if I have spoken truth, why do you strike me?" Annas was disturbed, but pride kept him from showing it. Confused, he left Jesus alone with the guards for nearly an hour. When he returned, he tried once more to probe Jesus' identity. "Do you claim to be the Messiah, the deliverer of Israel?" But Jesus only affirmed what he claimed, nothing beyond what the Father had appointed, that his mission was to all men, Jews and Gentiles alike. When Annas demanded to know if he had claimed to be the Messiah, Jesus simply answered, "So you have said." By then, the messengers from Caiaphas were asking when Jesus would be sent over from the Sanhedrin trial. The dawn was approaching. Annas, having failed to break or bargain with the master, sent him bound to Caiaphas. Outside, in the courtyard of Annas, another drama was playing out. John had gone with Jesus. Judas, seeing him there, had turned away towards the house of Caiaphas. Later, Peter arrived at the gate, cold and confused, his mind reeling from the garden. The portress knew John and admitted Peter at his request. Peter drifted toward the charcoal fire where servants and guards were warming themselves. He felt completely out of place. Surrounded by the enemies of his master, he should have been with the other apostles. Hidden as Jesus had advised, instead of lingering in dangerous territory alone and unarmed. Having discarded his sword, by the way. As he warmed his hands over the coals, the girl who kept the gate looked at him mischievously. "Are you not one of this man's disciples?" Peter should not have been surprised. John had just openly asked her to let him in. But fear clamped down in his heart. Only one thought filled his mind: save yourself. "I am not," he said. Soon another servant peered at him. "Did I not see you in the garden when they arrested this man? Are you not also one of his followers?" Alarm spiked. Escape seemed impossible. Peter denied again, more forcefully, "I do not know this man. I am not one of his followers." A little later, the portress pulled him aside with her sister. "We are sure you were one of his disciples. One of his friends asked us to let you in." and my sister has seen you with him in the temple. Why do you deny it?" Concerned, Peter lashed out with curses and oaths. "I am not this man's follower. I do not know him. I have never heard of him." He left the fire, pacing the courtyard, wanting to run but afraid of drawing attention. Getting cold again, he drifted back to the flames. One of the men near him listened to his accent and said, "Surely you are one of his disciples. This Jesus is a Galilean, and your own speech betrays you." Again, Peter denied the connections with Jesus. At last, he pulled away to the porch, hoping to disappear in the shadows. Over an hour had passed. The gatekeepers and her sisters stumbled upon him again and repeated the accusation, teasing him as a follower of Jesus. One more time he denied it. Then the cock crowed. In that instant, the word of Jesus had spoken earlier in the night rushed back to him. His heart broke under the weight of realization. At that very moment, the doors opened, and Jesus, bound, surrounded by guards, was being led out of the way to Caiaphas. As he passed by the torchlight, he saw Peter. Their eyes met. What Peter saw in Jesus' face was not anger nor even reproach, but a depth of pity and love that no mortal had ever seen. Peter could only follow a short distance, and then he collapsed by the roadside and wept bitterly. He had thought up to that moment that he had successfully avoided unjust questioning, that he had cleverly eluded arrest. Only now did he realize that in saving himself, he had denied his master, not once, but again and again. Having taken the first step on the path towards a cowardly compromise, he had found it almost impossible to turn back. It often takes a great and noble character once started wrong to stop and go right. Peter did not fully believe he could ever been forgiven until he met the risen Jesus and felt himself received as before. Inside the palace of Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin's court assembled before dawn. About 30 members gathered, not in the usual hall in the temple, but in the high priest's own residence, and only those who were already bitterly opposed to Jesus. John remained present by Jesus' side. False witness paraded forward, their testimony clashing, collapsing, contradicting each other. The law required 2 agreeing witnesses for any serious charge, but their lies tangled together and fell apart in front of everyone. Jesus stood in silence, looking calmly upon them, and his very presence unsettled their performance more than any defense. At last, 2 men managed to approximate agreement. They claimed that they had heard Jesus say that he would destroy the temple made with hands and rebuild another without hands in 3 days. Even this was a distortion of what he had said, but it was enough for Annas to argue that Jesus was a dangerous deceiver of the people and a threat to the temple, perhaps even a magician, promising impossible things. All this time, Jesus remained quiet. Caiaphas grew impatient. He could not bear the sight of a silent, unshaken prisoner standing there with such dignity. Abandoning all pretense of fairness, he strode up to Jesus, shook a finger in his face, and invoked the highest oath he knew. "I adjure you, by the living God," he said, "tell us whether you are the deliverer, the Son of God." Jesus answered plainly, "I am. Soon I go to the Father, and presently the Son of Man shall be clothed in power and reign once more over the hosts of heaven." At this, Caiaphas tore his garment in theatrical outrage. "What further need we have of witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" With one voice they shouted, "He is worthy of death, let him be crucified." The session degenerated quickly as they filed out. Many spat in Jesus' face and slapped him. Annas himself was shocked at their frenzy, but he had lost control of the court. Jewish law required a second session on a different day before the death sentence could be confirmed, with time for fasting and reflection. They waited only an hour. In that hour, Jesus was left in the custody of the temple guards and servants. They vented their brutality on him, mocking, striking, splitting, blindfolding him and taunting. "Prophesy to us, you deliverer. Who struck you?" Jesus said nothing. This was one of the bitterest portions of his cup. The hour of humiliation before ignorant, coarse men, goaded on by the example of their leaders. Across the universe, unseen celestial beings shuddered at the sight of their sovereign submitting to such abuse from his own misguided children. Yet even here he was not defeated. He chose not to contend on material terms. In these silent, battered minutes, he gained some of his greatest victories, revealing not only God to man, but man at his worst and at his best to God. The Son of Man stood fully identified as the Son of God, and on that union, he would one day invite all believers into the same kind of oneness with the Father. When the court reconvened for its second brief session at dawn, Jesus had brought into a nearby room where John waited with him. Guarded by the temple officers and a Roman soldier, inside, the leaders quickly drafted the charges they would present to Pilate. Knowing that blasphemy would mean nothing to a Roman governor, they recast their accusations in political language. He perverts the nation and deceives the people. He teaches them not to pay tribute to Caesar. He claims to be a king and a founder of a rival kingdom. No witnesses were heard to support these charges. They were invented in Jesus' absence, built on fear and hatred rather than truth. A few Pharisees, uneasy with the perversion of injustice, quietly withdrew. Some of the women of the household, curious about the strange prisoner, came to look on him. One of them asked, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I ask you, you will not answer." At 6 o'clock in the morning, they led Jesus from the home of Caiaphas and Annas, bound and bruised, to stand before Pilate, the Roman governor whose consent they needed to complete what they had already decided in their hearts. Man was about to sit on judgment of his Creator, and even then he loved them, and would have saved them if they would only let him.